Hey there, welcome to my channel. I just started this channel, and your support means the world to me. It helps me keep sharing the stories I love. This video is completely ad-free and designed to help you fall asleep fast and comfortably. Like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the kind of stories I share here. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's amazing to feel connected with all of you. Now, dim the lights, turn on a soft fan if you like, and let's drift into tonight's stories together. Story 1. My security camera caught me leaving the house, but I was asleep. The camera was for peace of mind, or so I told myself. In reality, it was a monument to anxiety, a sleek, white plastic obelisk mounted above my front door. Its single, unblinking black eye, a silent testament to my inability to trust the world. My name is David, and I'm a high school history teacher, a man whose professional life is a careful, chronological ordering of past events. My personal life, however, had recently become a chaotic, untethered mess. My wife, Jessica, had left 3 months ago. The split was amicable, a polite, heartbreaking erosion rather than a sudden, violent break. But her absence had left a void in our suburban two-story home, a silence that felt less like peace and more like a vacuum. The security camera, with its motion alerts and its 24/7 cloud recording, was my pathetic attempt to fill that silence with data, to replace the comforting presence of another person with the cold digital certainty of surveillance. For the first few weeks, the camera was a source of mundane, almost comical reassurance. It captured the mailman's daily sighing approach, a stray cat's nightly prowl across the porch, and a group of teenagers who, in a stunning act of suburban rebellion, had stolen a decorative garden gnome from my prize-winning petunias. It was boring, and that's what I wanted. It was proof that the world outside my door was predictable, manageable. The first impossible event occurred on a Wednesday. I had been up late, grading a mountain of painfully uninspired essays on the socio-economic causes of the French Revolution, and had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep. I woke up the next morning feeling groggy, a familiar low-grade exhaustion that had become my constant companion. I was making coffee when my phone buzzed with a notification from the Secure Home app. Motion detected at front door, 3:17 a.m. I frowned. It was probably a raccoon or the wind rattling the hanging fern. I tapped on the notification, my thumb hovering over the delete button. The app loaded the recorded clip. The timestamp in the corner read 3:17:22 a.m. The night vision was crisp and clear, bathing my front porch in an eerie monochromatic glow. And then I saw it. The front door opened. A figure stepped out. The figure was me. I stared at the phone, my heart giving a single, hard, painful thump against my ribs. It was undeniably me. I was wearing the gray sweatpants and the old faded t-shirt I had worn to bed. My hair was a mess. My face, caught in the ghostly infrared light, was slack, my eyes half closed, as if I were in a trance. The figure of me pulled the door shut behind it, the click of the latch unnervingly loud in the silent clip. It walked down the porch steps, turned right, and disappeared out of the camera's frame, heading down the street into the darkness. My first thought was that I had been sleepwalking. It was the only logical, rational explanation. I had never sleepwalked before in my life, but stress, grief, they could trigger strange, new behaviors. It was unsettling, but it was explainable. I scrubbed through the rest of the night's recordings. At 4:54 a.m., another motion alert, another clip. It was me again, walking back into the frame, up the steps, and letting myself back into the house, locking the door behind me. I had been gone for nearly an hour and a half. A cold, creeping unease began to settle in my stomach. Where had I gone? What had I done? I went to the front door and checked the lock. It was secure. I checked my keys. They were on the hook by the door where I always left them. My wallet and phone were on my nightstand. I checked my shoes. They were in the closet, dry and clean. The streets had been wet from a late-night shower. If I had been walking for over an hour, my bare feet would be... I lifted my right foot and looked at the sole. It was pink and clean, as if I had just stepped out of the shower. Not a speck of dirt, not a single blade of grass. The sleepwalking theory, which had been a flimsy shield to begin with, began to crack. That day at school, I was a ghost. I moved through the hallways, my mind a million miles away, replaying the silent black and white movie of my nocturnal excursion. My students, a tribe of perpetually bored teenagers, didn't seem to notice my distracted state. Their apathy was a small, welcome mercy. That night, I took precautions. I wedged a heavy rubber doorstop under my bedroom door. I even, feeling slightly ridiculous, tied a small brass bell to the doorknob. If I was going to go for a walk, I was going to wake myself up doing it. I went to sleep feeling a little more in control, a little more sane. The next morning, I woke up to silence. The bell was undisturbed. The doorstop was firmly in place. I felt a surge of relief. It had been a one-time stress-induced anomaly. I was fine. Then I checked the app. Motion detected the front door, 2:48 a.m. My blood ran cold. I opened the clip, my hand trembling. The front door opened. The figure of me stepped out. It was wearing the same clothes. It had the same blank, somnambulistic expression. It closed the door and walked off into the night. An hour later, at 4:02 a.m., it returned. I flew out of my bed, my heart pounding. The bell on my bedroom door was silent, the doorstop untouched. He hadn't come from my room. With a sense of dread so profound it felt like I was wading through molasses, I went downstairs. The house was quiet, still. The front door was locked. I began to search. I didn't know what for. A sign, an explanation. In the living room, on the plush beige carpet in front of the cold, dark fireplace, I found it. A single, muddy footprint. It was a man's footprint, about my size, but it was not from a bare foot. It was from a heavy work boot. I didn't own any work boots. The thing that was leaving my house at night, the thing that looked exactly like me, was not me. My life split into two distinct, terrifying realities. There was the daytime David, the history teacher, the grieving, lonely man who was trying to hold the fragile pieces of his life together. And there was the nighttime David, a silent, nocturnal creature who had somehow stolen my face and was using my home as a base of operations. My anxiety, which had been a low, persistent hum, became a screaming, high-pitched siren in my mind. I became an obsessive detective, my own home, the scene of an impossible crime. I set up more cameras, one in the living room, facing the front door, one in the hallway at the top of the stairs. I needed to know where he was coming from, where he was hiding. The next night, I pretended to go to bed, but instead, I sat in the darkness of my room, the door cracked open, my phone in my hand, watching the live feeds from the new cameras. For hours, there was nothing but the silent, empty, monochromatic landscape of my own home. I was starting to drift off, my head lolling against the wall, when the camera in the living room registered movement. I sat bolt upright, my eyes glued to the screen. It wasn't coming from upstairs. It wasn't coming from the basement. It was coming from inside the living room, from the wall behind the sofa. I watched, my breath held tight in my chest as a section of the wall seemed to ripple, to shimmer like a heat haze on a summer road. And then he stepped out of it. He stepped directly out of the solid plaster wall as if he were walking through a curtain. It was me, but it wasn't me. His movements were different, fluid, economical, precise. He walked to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped out onto the porch, right into the view of the original camera. He was gone. I stared at the phone, my mind completely, utterly broken. I was not being haunted by a ghost. I was not being stalked by a doppelganger. I was sharing my house with a creature that could walk through walls, a creature that had chosen for some unknown, malevolent reason to wear my face. My investigation became more frantic, more desperate. I needed to know what was on the other side of that wall. It was the main wall of the living room, the one that backed onto the garage. The garage was my space, my workshop, filled with woodworking tools and half-finished projects that I hadn't had the heart to touch since Jessica had left. The next day, I went into the garage. The wall was solid, covered in pegboard where I hung my tools. There was no shimmering, no ripple, just solid, dependable wood and plaster. I took a hammer, and with a trembling hand, I knocked a hole in the plaster. I tore away the drywall with my bare hands, my fingers raw and bleeding, and I found nothing. Just the wooden studs of the frame, the pink fiberglass insulation, the electrical wiring. There was no portal. There was no door. I was being gaslit by my own house. The creature I had started calling it the other was becoming bolder. It was no longer just leaving the house. It was interacting with it. One night, I watched on the camera as it came back inside, not at 4 a.m., but at midnight. It walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. It stood there for a long moment, bathed in the cold, white light. And then it began to eat. It took out a carton of milk and drank directly from it. It took a raw, packaged steak and tore it open with its teeth, devouring it, uncooked. Its movements were feral, animalistic. It was not me. I was a vegetarian. The fear was beginning to paralyze me. I was a prisoner in my own home, a zookeeper for a monster that looked like me. I was terrified to go to sleep, but I was also terrified of what I would see if I stayed awake. I was losing my grip. I called in sick to work. I stopped answering my phone. The outside world, with its neat, historical timelines, felt a million miles away. I knew I needed help, but who could I go to? The police? Officer, there's a man who looks just like me who comes out of my wall and eats my raw meat. They would have me in a padded room before I could finish the sentence. My one desperate hope was my brother-in-law, Mark. He was Jessica's older brother, a skeptical, pragmatic, no-nonsense electrical engineer. He was a kind of man who believed that every problem had a logical, solvable solution. I hadn't spoken to him since the split, but I was desperate. I called him. My voice was a wreck, a frantic, paranoid mess. I didn't tell him the whole truth. I couldn't. I just told him that I thought someone was breaking into my house, that my security system had caught some strange things, and that I was scared. I asked him if he could come over, if he could just be there. He was hesitant, but the raw, naked terror in my voice must have cut through his skepticism. He agreed to come that evening. His arrival was a brief, welcome injection of normalcy into my surreal nightmare. He walked through the house, checking the locks, the windows. He was a calming physical presence in a house that had become a landscape of psychological horror. "Dave, everything seems secure," he said, his brow furrowed with a mixture of concern and confusion. "What exactly did you see on the camera?" I couldn't bring myself to show him the footage of the other. He would think I had faked it. He would think I had finally lost my mind over Jessica. Instead, I showed him a clip of a shadow moving in a way it shouldn't, a flicker of movement that was probably just a moth, but that I presented as something sinister. He was unconvinced, but he was a good man. He saw that I was genuinely terrified, and he agreed to stay the night on the sofa. We sat in the living room, the television on but the volume low, a flimsy shield against the oppressive silence. I had my phone in my hand, the live feed from the living room camera open. The wall behind the sofa, the wall that was the source of all my terror, was just a wall. At around 2 a.m., Mark had fallen asleep, his soft snores a comforting human sound. I was still wide awake, my eyes burning from exhaustion, my body thrumming with a mixture of fear and a strange, desperate hope that the other would not appear, that its presence was somehow tied only to my own. And then I saw it, on my phone screen, the ripple. It was beginning. The wall behind the sofa, just a few feet from where Mark was sleeping, was shimmering. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream to wake him up, but I was paralyzed. The other stepped through. It was as silent as a ghost. It stood there for a long moment, its blank, empty face turned towards the sleeping form of my brother-in-law, and then it did something that shattered the last remaining vestiges of my understanding of the situation. It raised a hand and pointed at Mark, and its face, it changed. For a fraction of a second, the blank, slack features contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. A deep, guttural sound, like a snarling animal, emanated from it, not into the room but into my mind. I didn't hear it with my ears. I felt it in my skull. It was a wave of pure, concentrated malevolence, and it was directed at Mark. The other took a step towards the sofa. I finally broke free from my paralysis. I let out a strangled cry and threw my phone across the room. It hit the wall with a clatter. Mark jolted awake, his eyes wide and disoriented. "What the hell, Dave?" The living room was empty. The wall was solid. The other was gone. I couldn't explain. I just babbled about a nightmare, a loud noise outside. He looked at me, his face a mask of deep, troubled concern. He didn't believe me. He thought I was having a complete and total breakdown. He left the next morning, promising to call Jessica, promising to get me help. I had sought an ally, and I had only succeeded in confirming to the world that I was insane. But the incident had given me a new, terrifying piece of the puzzle. The other's rage had not been directed at me. It had been directed at Mark. Why? What was the connection? I spent the next 48 hours in a frantic, obsessive fugue state, tearing my house apart. I was no longer looking for a portal. I was looking for a reason. I emptied closets, I pulled up carpets, I tore through the boxes of old things that Jessica and I had stored in the attic. And in the bottom of a box of her old college textbooks, I found it. A small forgotten photo album? The pictures were from a period of her life she rarely spoke of, the year she had taken off before we met, a year she had spent traveling and finding herself. I flipped through the photos. Jessica with a backpack in front of a temple in Thailand, Jessica on a beach in Mexico, and then a photo that made the air leave my lungs in a painful rush. It was Jessica, standing with a young man, their arms around each other, a backdrop of snowy mountains behind them. The man was handsome, with dark hair and intense, brooding eyes. But it was the face. The face was almost identical to my own. We could have been brothers, cousins at the very least. The resemblance was uncanny, chilling. Beneath the photo, in Jessica's familiar looping script, was a single word. Liam. My hands were trembling. I had never heard the name before. I had never seen this man. But I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as a gravestone, that this was him. This was the original. And I was the echo. I called her. I hadn't spoken to her in months, not really. She answered on the second ring, her voice wary, laced with the concern Mark had undoubtedly poured into her ear. "Jess," I said, my voice a ragged whisper, "I need you to tell me about Liam." The silence on the other end of the line was a solid, physical thing. I could feel her shock, her pain, radiating through the phone. How do you know that name?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. And she told me. A story of a whirlwind romance, of a passionate, all-consuming love affair with a charismatic but deeply troubled man she had met while traveling. A man who looked, by some bizarre cosmic coincidence, almost exactly like me. A man who had been a rock climber. My blood ran cold. She told me about their last climb together in the mountains of Patagonia, about a sudden violent storm, about a fall. Liam had been tied to her. He had been above her. He had fallen, and his weight had pulled her from her own hold. He had been dangling, unconscious, and she had been holding them both, her fingers screaming, her strength failing. To save herself, she had cut the rope. She had never told anyone. She had been rescued, suffering from exposure and hypothermia, and had told the authorities that the fall had severed the rope. It was a secret she had carried, a guilt that had haunted her for years. A guilt that had, I now realized, been the silent, cancerous thing at the heart of our own marriage. The reason she had never been able to fully let me in, the reason she had always looked at me with a faint, almost imperceptible shadow of sadness in her eyes. Every time she looked at me, she saw him. And Liam had not rested in peace. His ghost, his rage, his profound sense of betrayal had not stayed in the mountains of Patagonia. It had followed the one person it was still connected to. It had followed Jessica. It had followed her to our home, and it had found a vessel. Me, a man who looked like him, who slept in his bed, who lived the life he had been denied. The other was not a doppelganger. It was a ghost, a tormented, vengeful ghost that had, through some supernatural psychological alchemy, imprinted itself upon me. It was wearing my face, but the rage, the hunger, the methodical, silent comings and goings, they were his. He was coming out of the walls of the home he believed was his, a home he had been cheated out of. And his rage at Mark, it was the rage of a man for the brother of the woman who had let him fall. I understood then. I was not the one being haunted. I was the one doing the haunting. My body was the house, and the ghost of Liam was the unwelcome tenant. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was not going to leave until he had what he wanted. He wanted revenge. He wanted Jessica. I told her to run, to pack a bag and leave her apartment, to go somewhere I couldn't find her, somewhere he couldn't find her through me. She thought I was having a psychotic break, that my grief and her confession had shattered my mind. But the raw, primal terror in my voice convinced her. And then I waited. I was the bait. This was my house, my body, and I was not going to let him have it any more. I set up the cameras again, all of them focused on the living room wall. I sat in a chair directly opposite, a single heavy iron fire poker in my lap. I was not going to sleep. I was going to wait for him to come out. And this time I was going to be ready. He came, as always, in the dead of night. The wall rippled. He stepped through. He looked at me sitting in the chair, and for the first time his blank face showed an emotion. Surprise. He had not expected me to be waiting. He had not expected me to be armed. "She is gone," he said in my mind, his voice a snarl of pure frustration. "Where is she?" "She is not for you," I said, my own voice a low, trembling thing. "This life is not for you. This body is not for you. You are a memory, a ghost, and it's time for you to leave." He laughed, a dry, rasping sound that was full of a cold, ancient hatred. "You are me," he sneered, "a weaker, pathetic version. You live in my house. You sleep with my woman. You are just the shadow I cast." He lunged at me. He was impossibly fast. I swung the fire poker, but it passed right through his shimmering, insubstantial form. He was inside my head, a crushing, psychic pressure, a wave of pure, concentrated rage and pain. I saw the fall. I felt the rope go taut. I felt the cold, sharp shock of the blade severing the line. I felt the long, terrifying fall into the abyss. He was trying to overwrite me with his own death, to drown me in his own trauma. But I was not him. My own grief, my own pain, was my shield. I thought of Jessica, not as the woman he had lost, but as the woman I had found, the woman I had loved, the woman I had failed in my own different way. I thought of my own quiet, ordered life, the life he had so viciously invaded. "No," I gasped, my vision tunneling, the room dissolving into a swirl of his angry, chaotic memories. "I am not you." I did the only thing I could. I dropped the poker. I stopped fighting him on his terms. I stopped trying to be a warrior. I was a history teacher, and I knew that the only way to truly defeat a ghost is to understand its story, and then to let it go. I didn't push back against his memories. I accepted them. I let his pain, his rage, his betrayal wash over me. And in the heart of that storm, I found the one small human thing that was left of him, his love for her, a love that had been twisted into a monstrous, possessive obsession, but a love nonetheless. "She is not here because she is safe," I project into his mind, my thoughts a calm, quiet counterpoint to his screaming rage. "And she is safe because I love her. And because I love her, I can let her go." It was the one thing he could not understand, the one thing his possessive, all-consuming ghost was incapable of. Forgiveness, acceptance, the quiet, heartbreaking, and ultimately liberating act of letting someone go. The pressure in my head lessened. The ghost of Liam recoiled as if burned. My acceptance, my surrender, was a language he did not speak. It was a rejection not of him, but of the rage that had defined him. It had taken away his power. He flickered, his form wavering, becoming more translucent. He looked at me one last time, his face a mask of confusion, of a pain that was no longer angry but just sad. And then he was gone. The ripple in the wall faded. He was not defeated. He was just released. The house was quiet, but it was a different quiet, a clean quiet. The vacuum had been filled. The haunting was over. I sold the house. I couldn't stay there. It held too many ghosts, both his and my own. I moved to a small, anonymous apartment in a different city. I don't have a security camera anymore. I am learning to live with the quiet, to trust the silence. Jessica and I are talking. It's slow and it's painful. There are too many ghosts between us. I don't know if we can ever rebuild what we had, but we are trying. We are two survivors of a haunting, each in our own way. Sometimes late at night, when I catch my own reflection in a dark window, I see a flicker of him in my eyes, a shadow of the man I might have been, the man she had loved first. He is a part of my history now, a dark, complicated chapter. He was a man who fell from a great height and who tried to pull the whole world down with him. But I cut the rope. I let him fall, and in doing so, I finally learned how to stand on my own. My daughter's imaginary friend knows too much about our past. The first time Lily mentioned peaches, it was a sun-drenched Tuesday in June. Sunlight, thick and golden as honey, poured through the bay window of our new living room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, blissful spirits. My wife, Sarah, was unpacking a box of books, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to decide where the Dickens collection should go. I was on the floor struggling with the notoriously vague instructions for a Swedish-designed bookshelf. Lily, all of 5 years old with hair the color of spun corn silk and eyes the deep, serious blue of a twilight sky, was having a tea party on the Persian rug we'd bought as a celebratory splurge for the new house. Her guests were a one-eyed teddy bear named Barnaby and a perpetually smiling rag doll called Daisy, and apparently a new addition. "No, Peaches, you can't have more sugar," she said, her voice a stern, motherly whisper. "It's bad for your teeth." I glanced over at her, a smile tugging at my lips. "Who are you talking to, Sweet Pea?" "Peaches," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She carefully poured a drop of imaginary tea into an empty spot on the rug. "He's very greedy." Sarah looked up from her books, her face softening into the kind of warm, maternal smile that had made me fall in love with her a decade ago. "Oh, we have a new friend? What does Peaches look like?" Lily tilted her head, considering the question with the gravity of a seasoned philosopher. "He's long," she said finally, "and he wears patchy clothes, like a scarecrow. And he's sad, I think. His face is all smudgy. An imaginary friend. The parenting books we'd devoured had told us to expect this. It was a normal, healthy part of a child's development, a sign of a vibrant imagination. We smiled at each other over Lily's head, a silent, shared moment of parental pride. Our little girl was creative. She was bright. She was normal. After everything we had been through, normal was the most beautiful word in the English language. We'd bought this house to be our fortress of normal. It was a 2-story colonial on a quiet, tree-lined street in a town where nobody knew our names. It was a deliberate, calculated escape from the city, from the ghosts of our old life, from the constant low-level hum of anxiety that had become the soundtrack to our marriage. This house, with its fresh coat of dove-gray paint and its sprawling backyard, was meant to be a new beginning, a place where the past couldn't find us. For a few weeks it was. Peaches became a fixture in our home. An extra invisible place was set at the dinner table. Lily would leave the bathroom door ajar so Peaches could get out. She would tell us stories about him, strange, disjointed narratives. Peaches lived in the walls, she said. He used to live in a dark, wet place. He was always cold. We'd nod and smile, playing along, marveling at the intricate world she was building. The detail about him being smudgy and sad was a little melancholic, maybe, but kids have a flair for the dramatic. We wrote it off as a harmless quirk. The first tremor, the first sign that the foundations of our new, normal life were built on something deeply unstable, came on a rainy Saturday. We were supposed to go to the town's Founders' Day picnic, but a sudden thunderstorm had trapped us indoors. I was trying to teach Lily how to play checkers, and she was, as usual, making up her own far more interesting rules. "Daddy," she said, moving one of my red checkers diagonally and then taking it off the board. "King me." "That's not how it works, sweetie," I laughed. "You have to get to my side of the board first." She looked down at the board. Her little brow crinkled. Then she looked up at me, her blue eyes eerily focused. "Peaches says you don't like to play by the rules either." My hand, which had been hovering over the board, froze. A faint, cold prickle ran up my spine. "What do you mean, honey?" "He says you took a shortcut once," she continued, her voice a perfect mimicry of innocent conversation. "On the old road, the one with all the rocks. You were in a hurry." She pushed another one of my checkers off the board. "You were going very, very fast." The air in the room suddenly felt thin and sharp. The sound of the rain against the windows faded to a dull roar in my ears. The old road, the one with all the rocks, the old quarry road. It had been 7 years, but the memory was branded onto the inside of my skull. A dark, winding ribbon of asphalt, slick with rain, hemmed in by woods on one side and a sheer drop on the other. A shortcut we should never have taken. I forced a laugh. It came out sounding brittle and strange. "I don't know what you're talking about, Lilybug. Peaches has a funny imagination." I looked over at Sarah, who was curled on the sofa with a magazine. She had heard. I could see it in the way her shoulders had tensed, in the way her hands were gripping the magazine so tightly her knuckles were white. Her eyes met mine, and for a fleeting second I saw it. The same cold, stomach-dropping fear that was currently coursing through my veins. But she blinked, and it was gone, replaced by a practiced, placid neutrality. Later that night, when Lily was asleep, I brought it up. We were in the kitchen, the only light coming from the small lamp over the sink, which cast long, distorted shadows across the room. "What Lily said today," I began, my voice low, "about the quarry road." Sarah didn't look at me. She kept her back to me, scrubbing a pot with a furious circular motion. "She's 5, Tom. She hears things. We've probably talked about it when we thought she was asleep. You know how kids are. They're like little sponges." "When have we ever talked about that night?" I demanded, my voice rising. "When? We made a promise, Sarah. We buried it. We never speak of it." "Then it was a coincidence," she said, her voice tight. She turned off the water and placed the pot on the drying rack. With a sharp, definitive clatter. A creepy, horrible coincidence, but that's all it was. It has to be. She turned to face me, and her eyes were pleading. She was begging me to believe her, to let her keep the comfortable blanket of denial wrapped around us. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to more than anything, to dismiss it, to rationalize it, to file it away as a creepy but meaningless event. So I nodded. I agreed. For her, for us, for the fragile new life we were trying to build. But as I lay in bed that night, listening to the rain and the creaks and groans of our new house, I couldn't shake the image of Lily's serious blue eyes. And I couldn't silence the question that was screaming in the back of my mind. Who the hell was Peaches? The coincidences began to pile up, each one a small, sharp stone added to the growing mountain of my dread. A week later, Sarah came home from the grocery store with a bouquet of yellow roses, her favorite. She put them in a vase on the kitchen table, a bright, cheerful splash of color in the sunlit room. Lily came running in, took one look at them, and her face crumpled. "Peaches doesn't like those," she said, her lower lip trembling. "They were his mommy's favorite. They make him sad." Sarah froze, her hand still on the vase. She looked at me, her face pale. Yellow roses. It was another detail, another piece of the mosaic of that night. The other car, the one that had spun out in front of us, had been a beat-up station wagon. The back was filled with groceries, spilled all over the road, and there had been a bouquet of yellow roses scattered and broken on the wet asphalt, their bright petals bruised and dirt-stained. It was a detail I hadn't even realized I remembered until that very moment. "How could she know that, Tom?" Sarah whispered later, after we'd managed to calm a hysterical Lily down by moving the flowers outside. "How?" "She couldn't," I said, my voice hollow. The rationalizations were getting harder and harder to construct. The coincidences were straining the laws of probability to their breaking point. Peach's presence grew stronger, his descriptions more vivid. He wasn't just long and patchy anymore. According to Lily, his hair was the color of mud. He had a big, ugly cut on his forehead that never went away, and one of his shoes was missing. He was always looking for his other shoe. I started watching Lily obsessively. I'd stand in the hallway just out of sight and listen to her one-sided conversations in her playroom. Her voice would be light and cheerful, but the things she said, the things Peaches was supposedly telling her, were chilling. "No, I can't ask them that, Peaches. That's a secret, because secrets are supposed to be quiet. I don't know why they didn't stop. Maybe they were scared." My blood ran cold. I felt like an insect trapped under glass, being watched by something ancient and malevolent. This thing, this Peaches, wasn't a product of Lily's imagination. It was an intrusion. It was something that had attached itself to her, something that was using her as a mouthpiece to terrorize us. The physical manifestation started subtly. A photograph from our wedding, which sat on the mantelpiece, would be turned face down. A single muddy footprint, too large to be Lily's, would appear on the welcome mat, even when it hadn't rained. The temperature in Lily's room would sometimes drop suddenly, becoming unnaturally cold, making the hairs on my arms stand up. Sarah was trying to hold on to her denial, but it was failing. I could see the terror in her eyes, the dark circles that were forming from sleepless nights. We were becoming ghosts in our own home, speaking in hushed tones, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. The silence between us was growing, filled with the unspoken horror of what was happening and the deeper, older horror of what we had done. The night it all shattered, the night we could no longer pretend, started with a song. I was tucking Lily into bed. She was quiet and withdrawn, as she often was now. She was clutching her one-eyed bear, Barnaby, so tightly her knuckles were white. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice small, "can you sing me the Crooked Man song?" I frowned. "I don't think I know that one, Sweet Pea." "Yes, you do," she insisted. "Peaches says you know it. It was on the radio, the night of the shortcut." And then she started to hum, a broken, off-key little tune. But it was unmistakable. It was an old folk song, one I hadn't heard in years, but it had been playing on the radio that night. I remembered it with a sickening lurch of my stomach. It had been playing right at the moment of impact. The cheerful, jaunty melody had been a grotesque counterpoint to the screech of tires and the sickening crunch of metal on metal. My breath hitched in my chest. I couldn't move. I just stared at my daughter, this perfect, innocent little girl who was humming the theme song to the worst moment of my entire life. "He wants you to remember the other man, Daddy," Lily whispered, her eyes wide in the dim light from the hallway. "Peaches says you left him. You left him in the dark, and he was so cold." That was it. That was the moment the floor gave way. I fled the room, stumbling down the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I found Sarah in the living room, standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. She turned as I entered, and she didn't have to ask. She could see it on my face. "Tom," she breathed. "She knows," I choked out, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. "She knows everything. The song, the other driver, leaving him there, this thing, it's telling her everything." The dam of our shared silence, 7 years in the making, finally broke. The story, the one we had buried so deep we could almost pretend it never happened, came rushing out. We were 24, young, stupid, and a little drunk from a friend's wedding. I was driving. It was raining, a torrential downpour that made the world outside the windshield a blurry, impressionistic nightmare. Sarah was navigating, and she pointed me down the old quarry road, a shortcut she'd heard about. I was driving too fast, showing off, feeling immortal in the way only a 24-year-old can. He came out of nowhere, a station wagon pulling out from a hidden side road. I swerved, but it was too late. The impact was a jarring, deafening explosion of sound and light. Our car spun, the world turning into a kaleidoscope of rain and shattered glass before we came to a stop in a ditch. We were alive, bruised, terrified, but alive. The other car was a wreck, crumpled and twisted, its headlights pointing at crazy angles into the woods. And in the sudden, ringing silence that followed the crash, we heard a groan, a single, low sound of pain coming from the other car. Someone was hurt. Someone was alive. And we were drunk. The smell of the spilled champagne was thick in the car. We looked at each other, and in that moment, a silent, terrible decision was made. Panic, cold and absolute, overrode everything else. It overrode decency, compassion, humanity. We were kids. We were scared of the consequences, of the red and blue lights of the jail cells we imagined. So we did the unthinkable. I put the car in reverse. The tires spun in the mud, and then they caught. I backed out of the ditch, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. We didn't look back. We just drove. We left the scene. We left a man groaning in the wreckage of his car alone on a deserted road in the middle of a storm. We got home, showered, and pretended it was a bad dream. The next day, scouring the local news online, my hands trembling, I found a small article, a single-car accident on the old quarry road. The driver, a man named Michael Rafferty, a 45-year-old widower and father of one, had been found dead at the scene by a passing motorist hours later. The article said he'd likely died on impact. We clung to that. We told ourselves that lie over and over again until it became our truth. He died on impact. Nothing we could have done would have saved him. Our leaving didn't make a difference. We sold the car for scrap. We moved out of our apartment a few months later. We started over. We built a new life, a good life. We got married. We had Lily, and we buried the ghost of Michael Rafferty so deep that we almost forgot he existed. But he hadn't forgotten us. He had been waiting, and now he had found us. He was in our house. He was talking to our daughter, and he called himself Peaches. The name had been a mystery, a strange, childish moniker. But now, as I stood in my living room, the full weight of our past crashing down on me, I remembered another detail. From the news article, Michael Rafferty had been on his way home from visiting his mother at a nursing home. Her name was Beatrice, but everyone called her Peaches. He was her only son. The entity in our house wasn't just a random spirit. It was him, Michael Rafferty. And he wanted something. After that night, the haunting escalated from psychological warfare to a full-blown physical assault. The whispers were no longer confined to Lily's room. I would hear them in the static of the television, in the rush of water from the faucet, my name spoken in a dry, rasping whisper. "Tom, you left me. It was so cold." Doors would slam shut in empty hallways. The lights would flicker and die, plunging us into darkness, only to flare back on moments later. One morning, I came downstairs to find every cabinet and drawer in the kitchen hanging open, their contents spilled onto the floor. On the kitchen wall, traced in a thin layer of spilled flour, was a single shaky word. Why? Lily was changing. Our bright, bubbly little girl was becoming a shadow. She stopped playing. She would just sit in her room for hours, staring at the wall, sometimes murmuring to herself. The dark circles under her eyes mirrored our own. She started drawing pictures, disturbing childish scribbles in black and red crayon, a drawing of a stick figure lying next to a mangled car, a drawing of a tall, patchy man with a sad, smudgy face standing at the foot of her bed. We were prisoners. The beautiful house we had bought as our sanctuary had become our jail, and Michael Rafferty was the warden. He was feeding on our fear, on our guilt. We knew we had to do something, but what? We couldn't call the police. We couldn't call a priest. We weren't religious, and it felt like a hollow, desperate gesture. We were alone with the monster we had created. The breaking point, the moment I knew we were in danger of losing not just our sanity but our daughter, came a week later. I was in my home office trying to work, though I couldn't concentrate. The house was quiet, too quiet. A sudden primal instinct, a father's intuition, screamed at me that something was wrong. I ran upstairs to Lily's room. The door was closed. I threw it open. The room was cold, unnaturally so. Lily was standing on a chair, which she had pushed up against the open window. She was leaning out, her small body silhouetted against the gray afternoon sky. "Lily!" I screamed, my voice cracking with terror. She turned and for a split second it wasn't her. Her face was slack, her eyes vacant and dark. Her voice, when it came out, was not the high, sweet voice of a 5-year-old. It was a low, rasping whisper, a sound that was both old and full of a terrible, wet-sounding pain. "He wants to show you how it feels," the voice said, coming from my daughter's lips. "How it feels to fall, how it feels to be broken." I lunged across the room, my heart exploding in my chest. I grabbed her around the waist and pulled her back, stumbling, falling to the floor with her in my arms. She started to cry, real terrified sobs this time. The presence was gone. It was just my daughter, trembling and weeping in my arms. "Daddy, I was scared," she cried. "Peaches was telling me to jump. He said it would be like flying." I held her, rocking her back and forth, my own body shaking uncontrollably. This was it. He wasn't just trying to scare us anymore. He was trying to take our daughter. He was going to make us feel the same pain he had felt, the pain of losing a child. We had left him to die, and now he was going to take the one thing that made our lives worth living. That night, after Lily was asleep in our bed, barricaded between us, Sarah and I finally faced the truth. "We have to leave Tom," she said, her voice a shattered whisper in the dark. "We have to pack a bag and just go. Leave the house. Leave everything." "And go where?" I asked, my own voice hollow with despair. "Don't you see, Sarah? It's not the house. He's not attached to the house. He's attached to us, to our secret. He'll follow us wherever we go. We can't run from this." "Then what do we do?" she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "What can we possibly do?" I was silent for a long time, the answer forming in my mind, a cold, heavy thing. It was an answer I had been avoiding for 7 years. "We have to tell the truth," I said softly. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "What are you talking about?" "We have to confess," I said, the words tasting like ash. "We have to go to the police. We have to tell them what we did. It's the only way. The secret, the guilt, that's his anchor. It's what's given him his power. If we release it, if we face the consequences, maybe it will set him free, and us." The terror in her eyes was replaced by a different kind of fear, the fear of public shame, of prison, of losing Lily to the system. "Tom, no, we can't. It would destroy our lives. It would destroy Lily's life." "He is destroying Lily's life right now," I retorted, my voice a harsh whisper. "He tried to make her jump out of a window today. What's he going to do tomorrow? We have no choice, Sarah. We either face the justice of the living, or we will be tormented by the justice of the dead for the rest of our lives, and we will lose our daughter in the process." We didn't sleep that night. We just lay there holding each other, with our daughter sleeping between us, the silent, terrible weight of our decision settling over us. As dawn broke, painting the sky in pale, watery shades of gray and pink, we knew what we had to do. But first, there was one more thing. We had to face him, not the police, not yet. We had to face Michael Rafferty. We had to confess to him. We decided to do it in Lily's room. It felt like his territory, the place where he was strongest. We waited until Lily was downstairs watching cartoons, a temporary, fragile truce having settled over the house. We stood in the middle of her room, the childish drawings and colorful toys a bizarre backdrop for what we were about to do. "Michael," I said, my voice shaking. "Michael Rafferty, we know you're here." The room grew cold. A floorboard creaked behind me. The air grew thick and heavy with a palpable sense of sorrow and rage. "We are so sorry," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We were just kids. We were scared. It's not an excuse. There are no excuses. But we were so scared." "We should have stopped," I continued, my own voice thick with unshed tears. "We should have called for help. We should have stayed with you. Maybe we could have saved you. We'll never know. And we have to live with that for the rest of our lives." The temperature dropped further. A little plastic horse on Lily's dresser flew across the room and shattered against the wall. A low moan seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. He was listening. "We left you," I said, forcing myself to say the words that had been buried for so long. "We hit you, and we left you to die alone in the dark. It was a cowardly, monstrous thing to do, and we are going to pay for it. Tomorrow, we're going to the police. We're going to confess everything. We're going to tell them what we did to you." The room was silent. The oppressive presence seemed to lessen, the anger replaced by a profound, bottomless well of sadness. "We can't give you back your life," Sarah sobbed. "We can't undo what we did. All we can do is tell the truth and ask you to please leave our daughter alone. She's innocent. This is on us, not her. Punish us, but let her go." For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched, thin and taut. Then, on the wall opposite us, a single word was traced in the condensation that had suddenly formed on the cold surface. It wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. It was just one heartbreaking word: lonely. And then, as quickly as it had come, the cold was gone. The presence, the weight, the feeling of being watched, it all lifted. It was like a pressure valve had been released inside the house, inside my own head. The room was just a little girl's room again. The sun streamed through the window, bright and warm. It was over. The confession, the promise of justice, had been enough. We had finally done the right thing, and it had set us all free. The next day we hired a lawyer and turned ourselves in. The story that followed was a messy public ordeal. It was in the papers, on the local news. We were the monsters who had fled, who had hidden for 7 years. We were judged, and rightly so. But through it all, there was a strange, unexpected sense of relief. The secret was out. The burden we had been carrying for so long was finally lifted. Because of our confession and the years that had passed, the sentence was lighter than it could have been. I served 18 months. Sarah, as a passenger, got 5 years of probation and community service. We lost the house. We lost our savings. We lost our reputation. But we never lost Lily, and the ghost of Michael Rafferty never came back. Lily has no memory of Peaches. To her, he was just an imaginary friend she eventually grew out of. Sometimes, late at night, I think about him, Michael Rafferty. I think about the life we took, the future we stole from him. The justice of the courts feels inadequate for what we did. My true sentence is the one I serve every day, the memory of his name whispered in the dark, the image of that single, sad word traced on the wall. We buried a secret, and in doing so, we buried our own souls. It took the haunting of our daughter to finally dig them back up. We live with the scars. We have to. It's the price we pay for being the people who drove away, leaving a good man to die alone on a dark, rocky road, with only the sound of a crooked man singing on the radio for company. The babysitter I hired doesn't exist. but she still sends me pictures. It began with a lie, though at the time I thought it was a lifeline. The lie was a website called sittersafe.com with its calming blue and white color scheme, its stock photos of happy, racially diverse families, and its promise of peace of mind for working parents. I was the target demographic, distilled to my purest, most desperate form. A single father, recently widowed, working a job that demanded more of me than I had to give. My daughter Maya was 6 years old, a tiny, fierce creature with her mother's wide, curious eyes and a spirit that deserved more than a tired, grieving father fumbling his way through each day. Her name on the website was Clara Bell. Her profile was a masterpiece of curated trustworthiness. The photo showed a young woman in her mid-20s with a kind, open face, a sprinkle of freckles across her nose, and warm, intelligent eyes. She was wearing a sensible cardigan. Her bio was pitch perfect, a child development major, certified in CPR and first aid, with a passion for creative play and a list of glowing 5-star reviews that seemed almost too good to be true. Clara was a gift, one review gushed. Our little Alfie is usually so shy, but he took to her immediately. Professional, punctual, and so wonderful with our kids. Another read, she even tidied the kitchen, a true gem. I did my due diligence. I paid the extra fee for the premium background check, which came back spotless. We had a video call, and she was just as she appeared in her photo, charming, articulate, and genuinely interested in Maya's love for dinosaurs and sparkly glue. She asked all the right questions. I felt the tight, persistent knot of anxiety in my chest loosen for the first time in months. I hired her for the following Friday night. I had a crucial dinner meeting with a client I couldn't miss. It was the first time I would be leaving Maya with someone other than her grandmother since Sarah had passed. That Friday, she arrived exactly on time. In person, she was even more disarmingly normal. She had a gentle voice and a calm, centered presence that immediately put Maya at ease. She'd brought a tote bag with a new coloring book and a set of crayons that had a glittery sheen. When I left, Maya was sitting at the kitchen table with her, chattering away, already fully under her spell. I drove to my meeting feeling a profound, almost dizzying sense of relief. The first picture arrived at 7:45 p.m. It was a photo of Maya holding up a drawing of a lopsided purple T-Rex. She was beaming, a gap-toothed smile of pure, unadulterated joy. The caption read, "The fearsome Mayasaurus, having a great time." More pictures followed throughout the evening. A shot of Maya in her pajamas, listening intently as Clara read a storybook. A blurry action shot of them building a pillow fort in the living room. Each photo was a little balm to my worried soul, a digital reassurance that I had made the right choice, that my daughter was safe and happy. The last picture came at 9:30 p.m. It was a photo of Maya fast asleep in her bed, her favorite stuffed sloth, Mr. Higgins, tucked under her arm. The soft glow of her rocket ship nightlight cast a warm, peaceful aura over the scene. Safe and sound. Good night from us. When I got home around 11, the house was silent and immaculate. The pillow fort was gone, the toys were back in their chest, and the kitchen was cleaner than I'd left it. I crept into Maya's room and saw the exact scene from the photograph. A perfect tableau of sleeping innocence. I felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it almost brought me to tears. Clara became our regular babysitter, Every week or two I'd book her, and every time it was the same flawless experience. And the pictures became our ritual. They were my window into their evenings, a steady stream of happy, reassuring moments. They were proof that I wasn't failing my daughter, that even in my absence, her life could be filled with fun and care. The first discordant note, the first tiny crack in the perfect facade, occurred about 2 months in. It was a Tuesday night. I was working from home, trying to meet a deadline. Maya was asleep upstairs. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was a picture message from Clara's number. I opened it. It was a photo of Maya, asleep in her bed, clutching Mr. Higgins, bathed in the glow of her nightlight. It was an almost identical replica of the picture she sent on her first night. The caption read, "So peaceful when she sleeps." I stared at the photo, a cold, confusing prickle of unease running down my spine. It was a Tuesday. Clara wasn't here. She wasn't scheduled to be. I was the only other person in the house. I checked the timestamp. The photo had been sent just seconds ago. My first instinct was rationalization. It must be a glitch, a delayed message from her last visit. But the caption felt immediate. I stood up, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I walked quietly up the stairs, my every sense on high alert. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. I pushed open Maya's door. She was there, in her bed, exactly as she was in the photo, fast asleep. I backed out of the room, my skin crawling. I texted Clara back. "Strange question, but did you just send me a photo?" The reply was instantaneous. "Yes, just thinking about what a sweet girl she is. Hope you both are having a good week." It was a plausible, if slightly odd, explanation. Maybe she was looking through old photos on her phone and sent one by mistake, then tried to play it off. It was weird, but not impossible. I tried to dismiss it, but the image of that photo, sent from outside my house, depicting a real-time event happening within it, was a splinter in my mind that I couldn't quite remove. The following week, I needed to book her again. I logged on to sittersafe.com and searched for her. Profile, nothing. I tried different search parameters. Still nothing. A profile not found error message appeared on the screen. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I went to our old messages on the site's platform. The conversation thread was there, but when I clicked on her name, the same error message popped up. Her profile had vanished. I pulled out my phone and called her number. A generic, synthesized voice responded, "The number you have dialed has been disconnected." Panic, cold and sharp, began to seep into my veins. This made no sense. I contacted SitterSafe's customer support. I spent 20 minutes on hold, listening to a tinny, looping piece of instrumental music that frayed my already raw nerves. Finally, a bored-sounding man named Kevin answered. I explained the situation, gave him Clara Bell's name. He put me on hold again. When he came back, his voice was different, cautious. "Sir, we've checked our records. We have no history of a sitter named Clara Bell ever having a profile on our platform." "That's impossible," I said, my voice rising. "I hired her through your site. I have the messages. I paid for a background check." "We have a record of your payments, sir," Kevin said slowly. "But they were for background checks on 3 other potential sitters, all of whom you declined to hire. There's no record of you ever even viewing a profile for a Clara Bell, let alone hiring her." My blood ran cold. I felt the floor drop out from under me. I hung up the phone, my hand trembling. I was in a nightmare. A woman had been in my house. She had been alone with my daughter, and according to the very service that had supposedly vetted her, she didn't exist. My first overwhelming impulse was to protect Maya. I changed every lock in the house. I bought a state-of-the-art security system with cameras covering every entrance, every angle. I spent the next few days in a state of hypervigilant terror, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, my phone clutched in my hand like a talisman. The pictures stopped. For 3 weeks, there was silence. I started to breathe again. I told myself it was some elaborate, terrifying scam, a phantom hacker who had created a ghost profile to get my credit card information. I told myself the danger had passed. Then the pictures started again. It was a Monday morning. I had just dropped Maya off at school. As I was pulling away from the curb, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. The picture was of Maya on the school playground. She was on the swings, her head thrown back in laughter. It was a beautiful, candid shot, except for the angle. It was taken from high up, as if from the roof of the school, a place no one should have been. And the photo was unnervingly intimate, a stolen moment of pure joy. Beneath it, a single line of text. She has your laugh. I almost crashed the car. My vision tunneled. My lungs felt like they were collapsing. It wasn't a scam. It wasn't over. Whoever or whatever Clara was, she was still watching us. The pictures became more frequent, more invasive. A photo of me at my desk, taken through the window of my home office. A picture of our grocery cart at the supermarket, the contents a perfect reflection of our weekly shopping list. A picture of my car parked outside my office. The photographer was everywhere and nowhere. The police were useless. I went to him, my phone in my hand, a wild-eyed, sleep-deprived man trying to explain that he was being stalked by a ghost. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They took a report, but without a suspect, without a crime beyond sending unsolicited photos, there was nothing they could do. They suggested I block the numbers. I did. She just used new ones. Maya started talking about her. She didn't call her Clara. She called her the picture lady. The picture lady was watching me play today, she said one evening, pushing her peas around her plate. What do you mean, sweetie? I asked, my voice tight. At the park. She was hiding behind a big tree. She waved at me. What did she look like, Maya? She was blurry, Maya said, frowning, like a picture that's all fuzzy. And she smells like old books, like Mommy's old books in the attic. The attic. My wife's collection of antique photography books. The air left my lungs in a painful rush. The next day, after dropping Maya at her grandmother's, I tore the attic apart. In the back, under a dusty canvas sheet, was a heavy wooden trunk I hadn't opened since Sarah died. It was filled with her prized possessions, old cameras, development equipment, and stacks of antique photographs and glass plate negatives she had bought at estate sales. I spent hours sifting through them, my heart pounding with a nameless dread. I was looking for a face, the kind freckled face from the CitiSafe profile. I didn't find it, but I found something else. It was a series of family portraits from the late 1800s, all from the same estate. The family was stern-faced and severe, posing stiffly for the camera, and in the background of several of the photos, slightly out of focus, was a young woman in a nanny's uniform. Her features were indistinct, but there was a certain posture, a certain tilt of the head that made my skin crawl. In the final photograph of the series, a picture of two small children playing with wooden hoops. The nanny was in the background, standing by a window, and she was staring directly at this camera. Her face was a pale oval blur, but her eyes were clear, sharp, and filled with a possessive, unsettling intensity. At the bottom of the trunk, I found an old, leather-bound ledger from the estate. It was a record of household staff. My finger traced down the list of names until it stopped. 1888, 1891. Governess, Clara Bell. The entry was followed by a single, spidery notation. Dismissed. Unwholesome attachment to the children. I felt like I was going to be sick. This wasn't a stalker. This was something else entirely, something ancient and impossible. A ghost who had imprinted herself onto these photographs, who had lain dormant in my attic for years. Had our grief, our loneliness, somehow woken her up? Had my desperate search for a caregiver on the internet provided her with a new medium, a new way to manifest? The pictures changed. They were no longer just of our present. One morning, I received a photo of me as a child, playing in the front yard of my childhood home, a home that was 1,000 miles away, a home my parents had sold 20 years ago. It was a real photograph, one I recognized from an old family album, but it was altered. Standing in the background, partially obscured by a tree, was the faint, translucent figure of a woman in a long, dark dress. She was inserting herself into my past. She was rewriting my history, weaving her ghostly presence into the very fabric of my life. The final straw came last night. My phone buzzed on my nightstand. I've become conditioned to the sound, reacting to it with a Pavlovian jolt of fear. I knew what it would be, but I was compelled to look. The picture that loaded on my screen was not from the past. It was not of the present. It was of a future I couldn't comprehend. It was a family portrait. I was in it, standing beside an older, grayer version of myself. Maya was there too, a young woman now, with the same sad, vacant expression as the man who was her father. We both looked pale, drained, like faded copies of ourselves, and standing between us, her arms wrapped around both of our shoulders in a gesture of maternal possession, was Clara Bell. Her face was perfectly clear, no longer a blur, no longer a photo on a website. She was solid, real, and she was smiling, a wide, triumphant, terrifying smile. She wasn't just watching us anymore. She was joining us. She was feeding on our lives, our memories, our very vitality. The caption beneath the photo was the most chilling of all. Soon we'll all be together, a perfect family, forever. I'm writing this now because I don't know what else to do. I've packed a bag. Maya and I are leaving. We're going to drive until we run out of road. I'm going to throw my phone into a river. I'm going to get a new one, a new number, a new life. But I know it won't matter. She's not tied to a place, not anymore. She's not just a ghost in the attic or a phantom on the internet. She's attached to us. She's a virus in our lives, and she's been sending me snapshots of our own destruction. I look at my beautiful sleeping daughter, and I know I have to try. I have to run, but I fear, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that no matter where we go, her pictures will follow. And one day, I'll receive that final faded photograph, not as a warning, but as a welcome home. The woods behind the cabin weren't just woods, they were an ocean, a deep, green, silent ocean of ancient pines and forgotten maples, and I had been drowning in it for 3 months. My wife, Eleanor, had always called me a creature of the city, a man who found comfort in the predictable grid of streets and the constant reassuring hum of other people's lives. She was right. The silence of the forest was a physical thing, a pressure against my eardrums, a constant reminder of the much larger silence she had left behind in my life. I came here to write, or at least that was the official story, the one I told my concerned friends and my well-meaning but utterly bewildered parents. I was a novelist, and novelists, according to cliché, are supposed to retreat to rustic cabins to wrestle with their muse, but my muse had died in a sterile beige hospital room 6 months ago. Her final breath, a quiet, unassuming sigh that had somehow sucked all the oxygen out of my world. I didn't come here to write. I came here to disappear. My name is Thomas Weaver, and I was a ghost haunting the life I had failed to save. My days were a featureless landscape of aimless wandering. I would walk for hours, following deer trails that petered out into nothing, my feet sinking into a thick carpet of pine needles and decaying leaves. The forest was a living, breathing archive of death and rebirth, a cycle I could observe but no longer feel a part of. It was on one of these walks, pushing deeper into the woods than I ever had before, that I found it. I was following the ghost of a creek, a dry, rocky bed that snaked its way through a particularly dense thicket of ironwood trees. The air grew still and heavy, the usual chorus of bird song and insect chatter fading into an unnerving silence. And then I saw it, standing in a small, unnaturally perfect clearing. It was a door, not the ruin of a door, not the last remnant of some long-forgotten homestead. It was a perfect, free-standing door, unconnected to any wall, any foundation, any structure at all. It was made of a dark, almost black wood, polished to a deep, lustrous sheen that seemed to drink the dappled sunlight. It was set in a simple, unadorned frame of the same wood, which simply rose from the forest floor and ended, a perfect, impossible rectangle of civilization in the heart of the wild. The doorknob was a heavy, ornate thing of tarnished brass, fashioned in the shape of a sleeping serpent devouring its own tail. My first thought was that it was an art installation, some strange surrealist project left to be reclaimed by nature. I walked around it. The back was as solid and seamless as the front. There were no hinges visible, no seams in the frame. It was a solid, impossible object, as out of place as a cathedral in the middle of the desert. I reached out and touched the wood. It was cool and smooth, vibrating with a low, almost subsonic hum that I felt more in my teeth than in my fingertips. I gripped the brass serpent and turned. Nothing. The knob wouldn't budge. I pushed, then pulled. The door was as solid and immovable as the ancient bedrock beneath my feet. It became my obsession, my secret pilgrimage. Every day I would walk to the clearing and visit the door. I would sit on a fallen log and just look at it, this beautiful, maddening enigma. It was a focal point for my grief, a perfect metaphor for my own life, a locked door to a place I could no longer enter. I would talk to it, my voice a raw, quiet whisper in the silent clearing. I would tell it about Eleanor, about the way she would bite her lip when she was concentrating, about the smell of her hair after a summer rain. I was a man confessing his sins to a wooden god, and the forest was my silent, indifferent cathedral. The first time it opened, it was an accident. I was in town, a small, weary-looking place called Black Creek, picking up supplies at the general store. The woman behind the counter, a kindly, grandmotherly type named Martha, was talking in hushed tones to another customer. Old Mr. Abernathy, a man who had lived in the valley his entire 94 years, had passed away peacefully in his sleep the night before. I didn't think much of it. It was the kind of sad, inevitable news that is the lifeblood of any small town. But when I returned to the cabin, the compulsion to see the door was overwhelming. I walked through the woods, my mind a numb, gray fog. As I stepped into the clearing, I felt a change in the air. The low, humming vibration was more intense, a palpable thrum that seemed to make the very leaves on the trees tremble. On a whim, born of nothing more than the ritualistic habit of my daily visits, I walked up to the door and placed my hand on the brass serpent. I turned. This time it moved. With a soft, sighing click, the latch disengaged. The door swung inward, silently, revealing not the forest behind it, but an impossible, shimmering darkness. It wasn't the darkness of a moonless night. It was a deeper, more absolute black, a velvet void that seemed to absorb all light and sound. And from it, a scent wafted out, a scent that hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was the smell of cinnamon, old books, and Eleanor's favorite Earl Grey tea. It was the smell of Sunday mornings in our tiny, sun-drenched city apartment. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, terrified bird. This was impossible, a hallucination, a trick of my grief-addled mind. But the smell was so real, so painfully, perfectly real. I took a hesitant step forward and peered inside. I saw nothing, just the endless, soft black. But I could feel it, the warmth of the morning sun on the worn wooden floorboards, the weight of our old patchwork quilt, the faint, distant sound of traffic 5 stories below. And then I heard it, her laughter, a light, airy sound that had been the soundtrack to the best years of my life. It wasn't a memory of her laughter. It was the thing itself, a perfect, resonant echo in the impossible space beyond the door. Tears streamed down my face. I took another step, my hand outstretched, wanting to plunge into that perfect, sensory memory, to wrap myself in it, to drown in it. But a sudden, primal fear, a deep, instinctual sense of self-preservation, held me back. This was wrong. This was a violation of the fundamental laws of the universe. I stumbled back, my heel catching on a root. I fell hard, scrambling away from the open door like a frightened animal. As soon as I was outside the immediate circle of the clearing, the door swung shut with the same soft, final click. I scrambled to my feet and rushed back to it, grabbing the knob, pushing, pulling. It was locked, solid, immovable. The smell was gone. The feeling of warmth was gone. The sound of her laughter was gone. I was alone again in the cold, silent woods. It took me 2 days to make the connection. 2 days of frantic, sleepless obsession, replaying the event in my mind over and over. The door, Mr. Abernathy, the timing. It was a hypothesis so insane, so monstrous, that my rational mind rejected it outright. But the part of me that had seen the impossible, that had smelled a ghost of a perfect Sunday morning, knew it was the truth. The door only opened when someone died. The thought was a venomous, seductive whisper in the back of my mind. I became a ghoul, a vulture of sorrow. I bought a small, cheap police scanner, the kind used by local news reporters and morbid hobbyists. I would sit in my cabin for hours, the static hissing, listening for the coded language of tragedy, a car crash on the interstate, a heart attack at the diner, a hunting accident in the state forest. My grief for Eleanor became twisted, perverted into a hungry, desperate anticipation for the grief of others. I was a man praying for funerals, not so that I could mourn, but so that I could get my fix. Each time a death was reported, I would race to the clearing, my heart pounding with a sick, shameful excitement. And each time the door would be waiting, the low hum, the soft click, the welcoming darkness, and each time the memory would be different. A fatal car crash on Highway 17 brought me the memory of our first date, the taste of the cheap red wine we'd shared, the feeling of a hand, nervous and electric, in my own. The death of a hiker who'd fallen from Black Creek Falls gave me the scent of the salty air on our honeymoon in Maine, the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. The door was a curator of my happiest moments, a library of my lost life, and the price of admission was a stranger's death. I was an addict. The real world became a gray, washed-out waiting room, a place I had to endure between my visits to the vibrant, perfect world beyond the door. The novel I was supposed to be writing lay untouched. I stopped answering calls from my family. I grew thin, my eyes taking on a haunted, feverish glint. The townspeople in Black Creek began to look at me differently, their friendly smiles replaced with wary, cautious glances. I was the strange, gaunt man from the city who bought too much canned food and seemed to be listening to something no one else could hear. And then the deaths stopped. For 3 weeks, the scanner was silent. The town of Black Creek, with a stubborn, infuriating resilience, refused to offer up a sacrifice. The door remained locked. I was in withdrawal, and it was an agony far worse than the initial raw grief. The memories, which had been a comfort, were now a torment, a paradise I had been exiled from. My grief, which I had thought I was processing, came roaring back, amplified and distorted. The door hadn't been healing me. It had been enabling me, keeping me in a state of suspended animation, a perfect, preserved stasis of sorrow. I became desperate. I would spend all day at the door, pleading with it, sometimes screaming at it until my throat was raw, my fists bloody from pounding on the unyielding wood. The silence of the forest mocked me. It was during one of these desperate, frantic visits that I found the bird. It was a small brown sparrow lying at the base of the door, its wing bent at an unnatural angle. It was still alive, its tiny chest heaving, its black, bead-like eyes filled with a silent animal terror. A thought, ugly and reptilian, slithered into my mind. I tried to push it away, but it was too strong. The addiction was too strong. I told myself it was a mercy. The bird was dying anyway. It was a kindness. My hands trembled as I picked it up. Its tiny heart beat a frantic, terrified rhythm against my palm. I closed my eyes, and with a quick, brutal twist, I broke its neck. The fragile bones snapped with a sound that was horrifyingly loud in the silent clearing. I stood there for a long moment, the small, warm, limp body in my hand, a wave of self-loathing so profound it almost buckled my knees. I had crossed a line. I had taken a life, however small, for my own selfish, pathetic need. With a trembling hand, I reached for the doorknob. It turned. The door swung open. The scent of cinnamon and old books washed over me. But it was different this time. Fainter. The feeling of warmth was gone, replaced by a subtle, creeping chill. And Eleanor's laughter. It had a thin, brittle quality, an echo of an echo. It was a flawed, corrupted memory, a cheap imitation. I stumbled back, the dead bird falling from my numb fingers. I understood then. The door was not just a passive gateway. It was a connoisseur. It was a parasite that fed on death, and the quality of its meal mattered. The peaceful, natural death of an old man, the sudden, tragic death of a stranger, these were one thing. The deliberate, cold-blooded killing of an innocent creature was another. The door had opened, but it was punishing me. It was telling me that the price for a perfect memory was higher. It wanted a more significant sacrifice. The next few months were a descent into a private, methodical madness. I became a hunter. I started with small animals, squirrels caught in traps, a raccoon by the side of the road that I mercifully put out of its misery with a tire iron. Each time I would justify it, a mercy, a kindness. And each time I would run to the door, a desperate, pathetic supplicant, and each time the memory of Eleanor would be a little more faded, a little more distorted, a little more soulless. The door was starving, and I was feeding it scraps. It was making me hungrier, more desperate. The day I found the deer was the day I knew I was lost. It had been caught in a barbed wire fence at the edge of my property, its leg torn and bloody, its eyes wide with panic and pain. It was a large, beautiful buck, full of a powerful wildlife force, and my first thought, the one that rose unbidden from the dark, twisted pit of my soul, was, "This one will be enough." I went back to the cabin and got the hunting rifle that had come with the rental, a dusty relic I hadn't even known was there. I told myself the same lie. It was a mercy. I couldn't let it suffer, but as I raised the rifle, my hand steady, my eye looking down the sight, I knew it was not about mercy. It was about me. It was about my need. The shot was deafening, a profane violation of the forest's sacred quiet. The deer fell, and as I stood over its magnificent dying body, watching the life drain from its dark liquid eyes, I felt nothing, no pity, no remorse, just the cold, clinical anticipation of the addict about to get his fix. I left the deer where it lay and ran to the clearing. The humming of the door was a triumphant, resonant thrum. I turned the knob. It swung open. The memory was perfect. It was our wedding day, the scent of the white roses in Eleanor's bouquet, the feeling of the cool gold ring on my finger, the sound of her voice as she said her vows, strong and clear and full of a love that I had believed was eternal. It was so real, so powerful, that I fell to my knees, sobbing, completely lost in the sensory perfection of the moment. When the door closed, and I was once again on my knees in the dirt and the cold, I knew with a chilling, absolute certainty what the door wanted next. The progression was logical, inevitable. It wanted a human life. It wanted me to become a monster. And the most terrifying part was that a part of me was considering it. The town of Black Creek was full of old, lonely people, people who might not be missed. The thought was a flash of pure demonic insanity, and I recoiled from it, horrified at the thing I was becoming. I was a man trapped in a feedback loop of grief and horror, and the only escape seemed to be to descend deeper. I decided to leave, to run. I packed my car in a frantic, paranoid haze, throwing my books and clothes into the back seat. I would drive west. I would never stop. I would put a continent between myself and that cursed clearing. I just had to visit it one last time. I had to say goodbye, not to the door, but to her. I walked through the woods, a man on his way to his own execution. I felt hollowed out, a husk. I stepped into the clearing. The door was waiting, and I knew, with the sudden, soul-shattering clarity, what the final, perfect sacrifice would have to be. Not a stranger, not an old man from town. Me, my own life, the ultimate offering, the final perfect death that would surely purchase the final perfect memory, not just a fleeting sensory echo, but the thing itself. An eternity with her, in that perfect, sun-drenched room beyond the door. It was a transaction, my miserable, grief-stricken life in exchange for an eternity of manufactured happiness. It seemed like a fair trade. I had the rifle with me. I had brought it to protect myself on the road. Another lie in a long, pathetic chain of them. I raised the barrel and placed it under my chin, my finger finding the cold, smooth curve of the trigger. My eyes were fixed on the door. I was ready. I was willing. "Don't, Tom." The voice was a whisper, a rustle of leaves, but it was her voice. It was Eleanor's voice. It had come not from the door, but from behind me. I lowered the rifle, my heart seizing in my chest, and turned. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the shadows of the ancient pines. It was not the vibrant, sun-kissed Eleanor of my memories. This was a pale, translucent echo of her form wavering like a heat haze, her eyes filled not with love, but with a profound, bottomless sorrow. "Eleanor?" I breathed. The name a prayer, a curse. "It's a trap, Tom," she whispered, her voice a fragile, distant thing. "It's not a memory. It's a cage. It feeds on life, but it traps the echo of a soul. Every time you open that door, you fed it, and you twisted my key in its lock." I stared at her, my mind refusing to comprehend. "What are you talking about? I was with you." "You were with a lure," she said, a single, translucent tear tracing a path down her spectral cheek. "A puppet, made from your own memories and my stolen essence. It's a parasite, a lonely, ancient thing that has been here since the first tree fell in this forest. It promises comfort, but it only offers oblivion. It promises reunion, but it only creates prisoners. Your death would be the final lock on the door. It would give it both of us forever." The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. The beautiful, perfect memories were a lie, a bait. I had not been visiting my wife. I had been desecrating her memory, feeding her soul piece by piece to a monstrous, timeless entity. My grief had not been a key. It had been the hook on which I had been caught. The door behind me began to hum, a low, angry, possessive sound. It knew I was being swayed. The air grew cold. "What do I do?" I cried, looking from the ghost of my wife to the terrible, beautiful door. "Live," she whispered, her form beginning to fade. "Live for both of us, Tom, the real way, the hard way, and let me go." She was gone. I was alone in the clearing with a humming, hungry door, and for the first time in a year I knew what I had to do. I was faced with a choice, a swift, easy death that would lead to an eternity in a beautiful, gilded cage, or a long, hard life filled with the real, painful, and ultimately cleansing fire of true grief. I chose the fire. I didn't run. I walked back to the cabin, my steps heavy but firm. I gathered the cans of gasoline I had for the generator and the axe from the woodshed. I returned to the clearing, a man with a purpose for the first time since Eleanor had died. I stood before the door, the source of all my monstrous actions, the altar of my twisted worship. I could feel its rage, its hunger. It was trying to lure me one last time, sending out the faint scent of cinnamon and old books. But it smelled like a lie now. It smelled like death. I swung the axe. The blade bit deep into the dark, polished wood, which screamed with a sound that was not wood, but a chorus of 1,000 trapped, tormented voices. I swung again and again, the wood splintering, a dark, viscous, sap-like substance bleeding from the wounds. I doused it in gasoline and threw a single lit match. The door erupted in a pillar of black, greasy smoke and an unnatural violet-colored flame. The screams from within it grew to a deafening crescendo, the voices of all its victims, all its prisoners, finally being released in a fiery, agonizing exorcism. I saw faces in the flames, fleeting, contorted masks of pain, and finally, of peace. And for a fraction of a second, I saw Eleanor, not the pale, sad echo from the woods, but the real Eleanor, her face full of light and love, her lips forming a single, silent word. Thank you. I stood there until the fire burned itself out, leaving nothing but a patch of scorched earth and a lingering foul smell that the clean forest air quickly carried away. The door was gone. The clearing was just clearing again. The silence was no longer a pressure. It was just silence. I left the cabin that day. I drove back to the city, back to the grid, back to the comforting, messy, and imperfect world of the living. The grief is still with me. It is a part of me now, a scar that will never fully fade. But it is a clean wound, not the festering, infected thing the door had made it. Sometimes, in my quiet moments, I remember the feel of the memories the door offered, their perfect, seductive beauty. And I understand that the greatest horrors are not the ones that threaten to kill us, but the ones that offer us a reason to stop living. I chose to live. I chose the pain. I chose the real, flawed, and beautiful memory of my wife, the one I carry inside me, the one that no locked door can ever contain or ever take away. I answered a phone call from my own number. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as a glitch, a harmless bit of digital flotsam in the ever-congested currents of modern communication. I was an architect, a man who believed in blueprints and solid foundations, a man whose life was built on the comforting certainty of physics and logic. Ghosts, hauntings, and paradoxes were the stuff of fiction, not the carefully ordered reality of my life with my fiancée Chloe. It was a Tuesday in October. Rain, gray and relentless, slicked the streets of the city, and I was running late. I was juggling a lukewarm coffee, a portfolio case that weighed a ton, and an umbrella that seemed to have a personal vendetta against my right eye. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. Fumbling, I managed to fish it out, expecting a call from my boss, a man whose patience was as thin as tracing paper. But the name on the screen wasn't his. It was my own. Daniel Reed. Beneath it was my number, the 10 digits I'd had since I was a teenager, as familiar to me as my own reflection. A spoofed number, I thought, some telemarketer in a distant country using a clever algorithm to get me to pick up. Annoyed, I swiped to answer, a sharp, "Who is this?" already on my lips. The voice that answered was my own. It wasn't just a similar voice, it was my voice, the exact same pitch, the same slight rasp from the coffee, the same cadence. It was like listening to a recording of myself, but a recording that was happening in real time. "Don't get on the 8:15 train," the voice said. It was calm, measured, but laced with an undercurrent of something I couldn't place. Urgency? Fear? I stood frozen on the crowded sidewalk, the rain dripping from my useless umbrella. The 8:15 was my train. I'd taken it every day for the past 5 years. "Who is this?" I repeated, my voice a half-strangled whisper. "There's going to be a power surge at the Fulton Street Junction. The train will be stuck in the tunnel for 3 hours. You'll miss the Henderson presentation." The voice was flat, matter-of-fact, as if reading a weather report. "Take the crosstown bus instead. You'll be late, but you'll make it." A cold, prickling sensation ran up my spine. The Henderson presentation was the biggest project of my career, the culmination of 6 months of sleepless nights and relentless work. Missing it would be catastrophic. This prank was too specific, too cruel. "Very funny," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Who is this? Mark? Is that you?" Mark was a colleague from work with a juvenile sense of humor. There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment I heard the faint, unmistakable sound of a ticking clock. It was the same sound as the old grandfather clock in my parents' hallway, a sound I hadn't heard in years. "Just take the bus, Daniel," the voice said, and then the line went dead. I stared at my phone, my heart hammering against my ribs. A prank! It had to be a prank, some new voice-mimicking software. But the specificity of it. Fulton Street Junction. 3 hours. It was just enough to make me hesitate. The 8:15 was pulling into the station, its doors hissing open. I looked at the train, then at the bus stop down the block. Logic warred with a primal, inexplicable fear. In the end, logic lost. I turned away from the station and walked towards the bus stop, feeling like a fool. An hour and a half later, I walked into my office, soaked and flustered, but just in time for the presentation. The office was in a state of controlled chaos. Mark rushed over to me, his face pale. "Man, you are the luckiest guy on the planet," he said. "Did you hear? The 8:15 is stuck in the tunnel between stations. Massive power surge at the Fulton Street Junction. They're saying it'll be at least another 2 hours before they can get them out." The blood drained from my face. I leaned against a cubicle wall, my portfolio case slipping from my numb fingers. It wasn't a prank. It was real. I had just received a warning from the future, from a version of myself who had somehow lived through the next 3 hours and called back in time to save me. The thought was so absurd, so completely outside the realm of my carefully constructed reality that I almost laughed. But the fear that coiled in my gut was cold and hard and very, very real. The calls became a regular, if terrifying, feature of my life. They were never scheduled, always unexpected. A buzz from my pocket would reveal my own name on the screen, and the Daniel on the other end would deliver a terse, cryptic piece of advice. "Don't order the salmon for lunch. You'll get food poisoning. Take a right on Elm Street. There's a pileup on the interstate. Chloe is going to call in 10 minutes, upset about her sister. Just listen." Each prediction, no matter how small or mundane, came true. The warnings were my own personal paradoxical guardian angel. I never told Chloe. How could I? She was a psychiatrist, a woman who dealt in the rational, the explainable. She would have had me committed, or at the very least, started looking at me with that gentle, clinical pity I couldn't bear. So I kept a secret, a strange, buzzing anxiety that lived just beneath the surface of my skin. I began to rely on the calls, to wait for them. My life, once a predictable series of my own choices, was now a reactive dance with a mysterious, omniscient partner. The tone of the calls began to change. The voice on the other end, my voice, started to sound different, more confident, colder. The helpful warnings began to be interspersed with more personal, more manipulative instructions. "Don't go to your parents' anniversary dinner on Saturday," the voice said one afternoon. "Why not?" I asked. The question was a reflex. I had learned not to question, but this felt different. "You'll have a fight with your father, a bad one. It will ruin the night. Just tell them you're sick." I followed the stale advice, calling my mother with a fake, rasping cough. She was disappointed, and I felt a pang of guilt. But the thought of avoiding the inevitable circular argument with my father about my career choices was a powerful sedative. Later that week, the voice told me not to go out for drinks with Mark and the guys from work. "Mark is going to get too drunk and say something about Chloe's past that will upset you," it warned. I bailed, feigning a migraine. The voice was no longer just helping me avoid traffic jams and bad seafood. It was pruning my life. It was isolating me, cutting the threads that connected me to the people I cared about one by one. And the most terrifying part was that I was letting it. I was a willing participant in the dismantling of my own social life, all for the promise of a smoother, conflict-free existence. The first time I saw him, the other Daniel, was a hallucination, or so I told myself. I was at home, working late. Chloe was out with friends. My phone buzzed. It was my own number. "She's not with her friends," the voice said, cold and sharp. "She's meeting with her ex-boyfriend, Michael. She's been lying to you." A hot, ugly spike of jealousy and fear shot through me. It was a lie. Chloe wouldn't do that. But the voice had never been wrong. I hung up, my mind racing. I went to the window of my study, which overlooked the street, and peered out into the rainy darkness. Across the street, under the fuzzy orange glow of a street light, a man was standing. He was holding an umbrella, his face obscured by shadow, but he was wearing my coat. The dark gray trench coat I had left at the office, and he was looking right at my window. As I watched, he lifted a hand and waved, a slow, deliberate gesture. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding. It was a stranger, a coincidence. My mind, frayed and paranoid from the stress of the calls, was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just seen a ghost. My ghost. The next day, the true horror began. I got to work, and my key card wouldn't open the door. After a call to security, I finally got to my desk to find an email from HR, informing me that my employment had been terminated due to gross misconduct and the unauthorized sharing of proprietary project data. I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice. I hadn't shared anything. I would never. My boss called me into his office. He wouldn't look me in the eye. On his desk was a printout of an email chain between my work account and our biggest competitor. It contained blueprints, cost analyses, the entire Henderson project. The emails were written in my style, with my turns of phrase. They were undeniably from me, but I had never sent them. I was escorted from the building, my belongings in a cardboard box. My life, my career, had been annihilated in a single inexplicable act of digital sabotage. I drove home in a daze, my mind a screaming vortex of confusion and terror. The voice hadn't warned me about this. Why? When I got home, Chloe was there. She was sitting on the sofa, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She didn't look at me. "Chloe, you're not going to believe what happened," I started, the words tumbling out of me. "I know," she said, her voice a dead, flat thing. "You told me this morning." I stopped, my hand on the doorknob. "What are you talking about? I haven't spoken to you all day." She finally looked at me, and her expression was a mixture of fear and pity. "Daniel, stop it. You called me at 9. You were crying. You told me you'd been fired, that you'd made a terrible mistake. We talked for an hour. You said you were going to go for a drive to clear your head." I stared at her, the world tilting on its axis. "Chloe, that wasn't me." "Then who was it?" she cried, her voice breaking. "Who was it that knew that I was having doubts about us? Who brought up that stupid fight we had last year, the one we promised never to talk about again? Who apologized for being so distant and promised to be better?" She stood up, her hands clenched into fists. "It was you, Daniel. But the man standing in front of me now, you're not him. You look like him, but your eyes, they're terrified. The man I spoke to this morning was calm. He was relieved. He was taken over. The voice on the phone wasn't a future version of me. It was a copy, an echo, a parasite that had been systematically clearing a space for itself by destroying my life, isolating me from my friends and family, and now it was starting to move in. The warnings hadn't been to help me. They had been to build my trust, to make me compliant. The man in the trench coat hadn't been a hallucination. He was real, and he was stealing my life. I had to prove it. I had to prove I was the real Daniel. But how do you prove you are yourself when a perfect copy, one who knows all your secrets, is telling everyone you're not? I became a ghost in my own life. I couldn't go home. Chloe was afraid of me, and I was terrified that he would be there. I checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, the kind that smells of stale cigarette smoke and desperation. I was running out of money, my bank account mysteriously frozen. He was thorough. My phone was my only link, my only weapon. The calls continued, but now they were taunts. "She misses you," the voice would say, and I could hear the smirk in it. "The old you, I mean, not the paranoid, erratic mess you've become. I'm taking her to that little Italian place you both love tonight. I'm going to be the man you were never good enough to be." I started my own investigation, fueled by caffeine and terror. I became a digital archaeologist, digging through the ruins of my own life. I searched for theories, for other cases, for anything that could explain what was happening. I found fragments, whispers in forgotten internet forums, and crackpot conspiracy sites. Stories of digital doppelgangers, of quantum echoes, of people whose lives had been hijacked by perfect, malevolent copies. Most of it was nonsense, but there was a recurring theme, a point of origin, a moment of intense trauma, a near-death experience, a place where reality had become thin and a person's identity had somehow been duplicated. My mind flashed back a year, a rain-slicked highway, the screech of tires, the blinding glare of headlights, a car accident that had left me with a broken leg and a concussion, but one which the doctors had said I was lucky to have survived. That was it. That had to be it. The moment I had almost died, a copy, a shadow of myself had been created, born from the trauma and the glitch in reality. This echo had been lying dormant, observing, learning, and now It was making its move. I knew I had to confront him, but a physical confrontation was useless. He looked like me. He sounded like me. He probably even bled like me. No, I had to expose him. I had to prove to the one person who mattered that he was a fraud. I had to get to Chloe. The plan was desperate, probably insane. The Echo knew my memories, my secrets, but he didn't have my soul. He didn't have my capacity for genuine, spontaneous emotion. He was a recording, a perfect but lifeless imitation. I had to create a situation where that difference would become glaringly obvious. I called Chloe from a payphone. She answered, her voice wary. "Chloe, it's me," I said, my voice raw. "I don't know who this is anymore," she whispered. I know you're scared and confused, but I need you to listen to me. I can prove it. I can prove that the man you've been talking to is not me. Meet me tonight at the old observatory." The observatory was our place. It was where I had proposed to her on a clear summer night under a canopy of 1,000,000 stars. It was a place of deep, shared meaning, a place I hoped the Echo wouldn't understand on an emotional level. "Why should I?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because a small part of you still knows it's me," I said, praying I was right. "Because you know the man you've been living with for the past week is off. A little too perfect, a little too calm. He's what I've always tried to be, but he's not what I am. 8 o'clock. Please, Chloe, my life depends on it." I hung up before she could refuse. Then I called my own number. The Echo answered on the first ring. "Getting desperate, are we?" he said, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "It's over," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm meeting Chloe at the observatory at 8. I'm going to tell her everything." "You do that?" The Echo laughed. "She'll think you've finally lost your mind completely. In fact, I think I'll come too. It will be fun to watch." It was exactly what I wanted. That night, the air was cold and sharp. The observatory stood on its hill like a silent white domed sentinel against the star-dusted sky. I got there early, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Chloe arrived at 8 on the dot. She was wrapped in a thick coat, her face pale and drawn in the moonlight. She stood 10 feet away from me, her arms crossed, a wall of fear and distrust between us. "Daniel, this is crazy," she began. "Just listen," I pleaded. "He's coming. You're going to see us both." As if on cue, a figure emerged from the shadows of the parking lot. It was me. He was wearing my favorite leather jacket, his hair styled exactly like mine. He walked towards us with a confident, easy stride. He stopped beside Chloe and put a protective arm around her shoulder. She flinched, but didn't pull away. "See, honey?" the Echo said, his voice a perfect imitation of my own, full of gentle concern. "I told you he was unwell. He needs help." Chloe looked from him to me, her eyes wide with a terrifying, disbelieving comprehension. Seeing us both there, 2 identical men, was shattering her reality. "This is impossible," she breathed. "Now, Chloe," I said, my voice shaking, "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to ask him the same question. It's the question you asked me right here, on this spot, the night I proposed." Her brow furrowed in confusion. "The question?" "You know the one," I urged, my eyes locked on hers, trying to pour every ounce of our shared history, our love, our genuine connection, into that single gaze. She turned to the Echo. What was the question?" The Echo smiled, a smooth, confident expression. "It's a trick, sweetheart. You never asked me a question. You were crying so hard you could barely speak. You just nodded and kissed me. It was a good guess, a logical one. It was what had happened on the surface, but it wasn't the truth. Chloe's eyes widened. She turned to me. Daniel? I took a deep breath. You looked up at the moon and you asked me, if we build a life as beautiful as that, will we be afraid to live in it? And I told you, only if we live in it alone. Chloe let out a choked sob. It was a small, intimate, nonsensical detail, a fragment of a memory so personal it had never been spoken of again. A memory a perfect copy could never have, because it wasn't a memory of fact, but a memory of feeling. It was the emotional texture of our lives, something he couldn't access. The Echo's smile faltered. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than confidence in his eyes. Confusion. And then rage. It's a lucky guess, he snarled, his voice losing its perfect mimicry, becoming harsher, flatter. He's been stalking us, listening to us. But the spell was broken. Chloe took a step away from him towards me. Get away from me, she whispered to the Echo. The Echo's face contorted, the mask of me slipping to reveal the monster beneath. You can't have her. You can't have this life. It's mine. I earned it. I'm better than you. I'm the version of you without the anxiety, without the doubt, without the crippling fear of failure. I'm what you always wanted to be. You're a ghost, I said, my own voice finding a strength I didn't know it possessed. You're an echo of a bad memory. You're nothing. He lunged at me, his face a mask of fury. But he wasn't lunging at me in the physical world. I felt a sudden psychic pressure, a crushing assault on my mind. He was trying to invade my consciousness, to overwrite me. I saw flashes of the car crash, felt the phantom pain in my leg, the terror of the spinning metal. He was using my own trauma as a weapon against me. But I wasn't the same man who had been in that crash. The last few weeks had forged a new kind of resilience in me. I had been stripped of everything I thought defined me, my job, my home, my identity, and I was still standing. I pushed back, not with anger, but with acceptance. I accepted the fear. I accepted the doubt. I accepted the flawed, messy, imperfect reality of who I was. You're right, I projected into his mind. I am afraid. I am doubtful. That's what makes me real. You're just a copy, a perfect, empty copy. The Echo screamed, a sound that was both in the air and inside my head. His physical form began to flicker like a bad television signal. He was an entity built on a stolen identity, and now that his foundation had been proven false, he was coming apart. He wavered, his image stretching and distorting, his features melting like hot wax. He looked at me one last time, his eyes filled not with rage, but with a terrifying hollow emptiness. And then he dissolved, turning into a cloud of shimmering, static-like particles that were caught in the wind and scattered into the night. Silence. The only sound was Chloe's ragged breathing and the distant hum of the city. I stumbled forward, and she met me halfway, her arms wrapping around me in a desperate, clinging embrace. We just stood there for a long time, under the cold, silent watch of the stars, two survivors of an impossible storm. We rebuilt. It wasn't easy. The world doesn't have a protocol for dealing with a supernatural doppelganger who commits identity theft. I couldn't get my old job back, but I found a new one. We moved to a new apartment, trying to outrun the ghosts of our old life. The trust between Chloe and me, though shattered, was slowly, painstakingly being glued back together. We were scarred, but we were real. But I know he's not truly gone, not completely. He wasn't a creature I could kill. He was a possibility I had to disprove. He was a part of me, a dark potential, a shadow born from my own fear. I defeated him, but I can't destroy him. He's a latent file in the universe's hard drive, waiting. And so every time my phone rings with an unknown number, my heart seizes in my chest. Every time I see my own reflection in a dark window, I look for a flicker, a distortion. I live with the constant, quiet, terrifying knowledge that reality is a fragile thing, and that somewhere, in the static between the signals, a version of me is still out there, and he might just decide to call again. I found a hidden room behind my mirror. Someone was living there. I inherited the apartment from my great-aunt Beatrice, a woman whose life had been a meticulous study in quiet routine right up until the point where she wasn't quiet anymore. It was a pre-war brownstone unit, 3 floors up, with impossibly high ceilings, crown molding that looked like carved icing, and a labyrinthine heating system that hissed and groaned like a sleeping dragon. The whole place smelled faintly of mothballs and old dry paper, and while it was beautiful, it was undeniably old, full of architectural secrets and the kind of strange permanent shadows that modern lighting couldn't seem to dispel. I moved in because the rent was non-existent, and because I, too, enjoyed the quiet routine that the building seemed to enforce. The apartment's master bathroom was particularly strange. It was large and overly ornate for a bathroom, featuring a clawfoot tub and a massive, antique-looking mirror that dominated the entire wall above the pedestal sink. The mirror was huge, framed in dark, heavy carved oak, and it was bolted directly into the plaster. It wasn't the kind of mirror you could simply lift and move. It felt like a fixture, a permanent portal in the room's history. I tried to clean it, but glass had an inherent subtle distortion, a kind of rippling imperfection that made my reflection seem slightly warped, stretched, or sometimes just out of sync with my movements. I put it down to the age of the glass and the silver backing, but I always felt an unpleasant chill when I stood too close to it, a strange, localized cold spot that lingered no matter how high I cranked the radiator. It was that cold spot that first became a nuisance, and then a horrifying clue. I am a meticulous person, a creature of habit and order, and I hate inefficiency. The draft, or whatever it was wasting my heat. I started my investigation with a thermal gun, the kind used for home energy audits. The plaster wall around the mirror registered a consistent 72 degrees, the room temperature. But the exact center of the mirror, the focal point where my reflection's face usually was, registered a baffling 58 degrees. It was a localized, persistent cold, not a draft, but a chill coming from inside the wall. Intrigued, I tapped the glass. The sound was solid near the edges, a heavy, dull thud of glass against plaster. But as I moved my knuckles toward the cold spot, the thud changed. It became hollower, lighter, and echoing, unsettling tap, tap, tap that suggested a significant, unsupported cavity behind the frame. I ran my hand over the oak frame, feeling for a hinge or a latch, but the thing was bolted down with iron screws that had been painted over and sealed with layers of glossy enamel. I decided I had to see what was back there. It was likely a bricked-up chimney flue, a long-forgotten service shaft, or maybe just a clumsy repair job. I told myself it was for the sake of energy efficiency. It took me 3 hours with a screwdriver, a utility knife, and a lot of swearing to chip away the paint and pry the decorative molding off the mirror's frame. The frame itself was held in place by 4 enormous heavy-gauge bolts sunk deep into the wall. As I loosened the last one, the massive mirror gave a shudder and pitched forward an inch, revealing a shocking amount of dust and grime and a thin, dark line of shadow between the frame and the wall. I slowly, carefully, lowered the mirror onto the bathroom floor, the glass reflecting the ceiling and the frantic, pale image of my own face. What was revealed was not a bricked-up flue, but an archway. It was a small, crudely cut opening in the plaster and lath, roughly the size of a man's torso, almost perfectly centered where the cold spot had been. The edges of the opening were ragged, showing the inner structure of the wall, but there was no plaster dust on the floor below it. That meant the opening had been there for a long time. The biggest shock, however, was what the opening led to. It didn't lead to darkness or a void or the back of a chimney. It led to a space that was clearly a room. I shone the flashlight of my phone into the cavity. It wasn't a standard crawl space. It was a narrow, elongated room, maybe 6 feet wide and 15 feet long, running parallel to the bathroom wall and extending into the dead space between my apartment and the building's main staircase, or maybe another unit. The walls were unfinished brick, and the floor was covered in a layer of old, fine, metallic-smelling dust, the kind that accumulates in forgotten, unventilated spaces. But the dust had been disturbed. There was a clear, swept pathway leading from the opening deeper into the dark. And then I saw the objects. The first thing I registered was a sleeping cot, a simple canvas military-style bed positioned in the furthest corner. It was neatly made, but the pillow was dented, the blanket slightly rumpled, a clear sign of recent use. Next to the cot, there was a makeshift shelf fashioned from a piece of old wood placed atop 2 stacked bricks, and on that shelf a few personal items: a small tarnished silver cup, a worn, paper-covered book that I couldn't make out the title of, and next to the shelf, tucked discreetly against the wall, a 5-gallon plastic bucket, presumably for sanitary purposes. But the detail that locked the horror in my throat, freezing the air in my lungs, was the tray. Placed near the opening, directly facing where the mirror had been, was a small silver-rimmed tea tray. On it sat a ceramic plate with half a tuna salad sandwich, neatly cut and covered with a piece of plastic wrap. It wasn't moldy. The bread hadn't gone stale. It had been left there at most a few hours prior. Someone was living here. Someone had been living here today. I took a step back, the phone slipping in my sweaty hand. The person who lived here was not a vagrant who had broken in. This room was an architectural anomaly, a permanent hidden space accessed through a secret hole in my wall, a hole that was covered by a massive, centuries-old mirror. The occupant had to have known the architecture, had to have a key, or an incredible talent for stealth. Then my eyes snapped back to the opening, and specifically to the inner side of the mirror frame that was now resting on my floor. I ran my fingers over the glass. On the side that had faced the wall where the archway was, there was a patch of clear, pristine glass about the size of a small window pane. The rest of the backing was opaque and silvery, but this one section had been chemically stripped, replaced by a specialized translucent film. It wasn't a mirror on that side at all. It was a cleverly disguised one-way window. The realization hit me like a physical blow, a rush of nausea that made the already close air of the bathroom feel suffocating. I hadn't just been looking at my reflection for the past 2 months. I had been observed. Every morning, shaving, brushing my teeth, staring into the glass, I hadn't been alone. The person inside had been watching me, their cot positioned perfectly so that my face, my routine, the minutiae of my solitary life were their entertainment, their window to the outside world. The slight distortion I had always complained about was the result of the crude one-way film, not the age of the glass. The cold spot was their breathing, their body temperature, their proximity to the pain. I scrambled out of the bathroom, shutting the door and locking it with a desperate, frantic click of the cheap brass bolt. I called the police. When they arrived, they were skeptical. They were thorough, though, and they crawled into the space. They found the cot, the bucket, the shelf. But the sandwich was gone. The plate was empty, wiped clean. The book was closed and pushed further back on the shelf. The police found no fingerprintable surfaces, no documents, no evidence of a crime beyond trespassing. They theorized it was a transient, a squatter who knew the old building's layout, who had been hiding there, and who had fled when I started removing the mirror. They taped off the area, filed a report that mentioned a likely unhoused individual, and left. I knew they didn't believe the part about the one-way mirror, suggesting I was overreacting due to the shock. I didn't replace the mirror. I couldn't. Instead, I boarded up the archway with 2x4s and several layers of drywall, sealing the opening with a thick coat of plaster, the smell of which was meant to replace the metallic dust I had smelled. I tried to convince myself it was over, that the person had fled the building, but the knowledge of the hidden room had irrevocably altered my reality. That's when the sounds began. They weren't coming from the sealed-up mirror room, or at least not only from there. They came from the walls, not the loud, familiar creaks of an old building settling, but soft, dry, insidious noises. A faint, rhythmic scrabbling like fingernails on dusty plaster, or the movement of a tiny animal, but too controlled, too deliberate to be a mouse. A soft, measured thump-tap slide, a sound that seemed to be traveling in the dead spaces between the joists, the service shafts, and the vertical pipes of the ancient heating system. I would be reading in my living room, and the sound would be directly behind the bookcase. I would be in my kitchen, and it would seem to emanate from the space between the cupboard and a wall. I realized the mirror room wasn't the person's only space. It was their observatory. Their home was the entire forgotten, hidden infrastructure of the building, a complex, dark network of architectural dead space that was only accessible to someone impossibly small, flexible, and utterly silent. They were living in the negative space of the brownstone like a parasite in the host's body, and my apartment was merely one visible surface of their sprawling, invisible habitat. The terror became an exquisite, personalized form of psychological torture, My things would be subtly moved. I would leave my wallet on the hall table and later find it pushed half an inch further toward the wall. I'd be certain I'd close the window latch before leaving for work, only to find it slightly ajar when I returned. One evening I reached for my toothbrush and noticed it was distinctly wet when I knew I hadn't used it for hours. These were not the signs of a burglar or a vandal. They were the signs of an intimate observer, someone who had learned my habits so well they could use the briefest moments of my absence to slip out, move freely, and then retreat back into the silent, dusty labyrinth. The ultimate psychological attack came one night when I was asleep. I woke up suddenly with that visceral jolt of someone watching you. The room was black, silent, the kind of absolute darkness that presses down on your eyelids. I held my breath, listening, the frantic hammering of my own heart deafening in my ears. And then I heard it, a soft, dry, almost papery cough that came from the wall directly behind my headboard. It was the cough of a person, but one whose lungs were choked with old dust and the dry air of unventilated space. It was right there. I shot out of bed, slammed on the light, and stared at the beige, innocuous wall. Nothing. No vent, no crack, no seam. Just the solid, painted plaster. I stopped trying to escape the reality. I accepted terrible truth. I was sharing my life with an elegant silent shadow, a forgotten dweller of the city's unseen spaces who used my apartment as a source of warmth and human observation. I went to the sealed-up bathroom. The freshly plastered archway looked solid, but I could hear a faint, high-pitched, scritching sound coming from within the wall. I grabbed a Sharpie and a piece of paper, and I taped the note to the newly painted wall directly over where the one-way mirror had been. The words were a mix of desperation and challenge. Who are you? Please, stop. Why are you here? You need help? The next morning, the note was gone. The tape was still there, a pale frame around nothing. In its place, stuck to the plaster with a tiny, nearly invisible dab of what looked like dried mud, was a small, meticulously folded piece of paper, no bigger than a matchbook. I had to use tweezers to retrieve it. The handwriting was thin, elegant, almost spider-like, a script from a forgotten century, yet completely legible. The message was 3 chilling, impossible words. I am your silent twin. You are too loud. The insult wasn't just in the words. It was in the revelation that my life, my quiet life, was an intolerable racket to this person. My movements, my breathing, the sound of my television, the scraping of my chair, all of it was a cacophony disrupting their perfect, absolute silence. I knew I had to see them. I had to know what kind of human being could exist in such a space. I had to face my silent twin. That night, I waited. I set up my phone on a tripod with the flash off, recording video, and I sat on the floor of the bathroom, a blanket wrapped around me, a heavy wrench lying uselessly beside me. The main lights were off, the only illumination coming from the thin sliver of light beneath the door. Hours passed. The building settled. The heating system finally fell silent. I was a man of routine, and my routine was to sleep. Despite the fear, despite the adrenaline, my body betrayed me. I slumped against the wall, and exhaustion, my old enemy, finally claimed me. I woke with a jolt. The air in the room was suddenly, drastically colder. I hadn't heard a sound. I fumbled for my phone, my hand shaking, and looked at the time. 3:17 a.m. I had been asleep for maybe 20 minutes. I stared at the sealed archway, expecting to see a fresh hole, but the plaster was intact. The scrabbling sound, however, was back, and it was loud, no longer behind the plaster, but right next to me. I realized the sound was coming from the air vent near the floor, the old cast-iron grill on the baseboard that fed the heating system. I spun around, wrench in hand, and focused the dim light of the phone screen on the vent. It wasn't just a sound. The vent cover was slightly ajar, tilted outward at a small, impossible angle, and from the thin black gap created by that angle, something was moving. It was a person, impossibly thin, dressed in layers of old dusty gray fabric that seemed to blend perfectly with the shadows and the dirty plaster. Their face was a pale, wedge-shaped mask, their hair matted with dust, but their eyes were the thing that held me. They were huge, dinner-plate-sized, dilated to absolute blackness, reflecting the pinprick of my phone light like twin black mirrors. They were the eyes of a creature accustomed to near-absolute, perpetual darkness, eyes that found my faint illumination blinding. They were not menacing. They were terrified. They froze, seeing me, the light, the weapon. For a single, terrifying second, our lives intersected, the man of the light, the man of the dark. And then, with an impossible fluidity, a speed that defied the limits of the human skeleton, the creature slid backward, not running, but smoothly retreating, pulling their thin, dusty body through the narrow ventilation grill. I heard the sound of dry, brittle bones flexing and the rustle of old cloth. The cast-iron grill, which was heavy and usually required a screwdriver to move, pulled itself shut with a soft, decisive click. I sat there for an hour, the light blazing, the wrench still in my hand, staring at the perfectly closed vent. I knew I couldn't report this. I knew the police would institutionalize me. I knew I was not safe. I moved out the next day. I left the furniture, the keys, everything. I moved to a sleek, modern glass and steel apartment tower, a sterile world of new construction where there are no hidden spaces, no old service shafts, no architectural dead zones for a shadow dweller to hide. I live on the 22nd floor, surrounded by sealed walls and new HVAC systems. But I am not free. Every rhythmic thrum of the building's central air conditioning sends a cold wave of panic through me. Every shadow cast by the city lights at night seems to hold a shape that is impossibly thin. I jump at the sound of the elevator moving in the wall, and 1 month ago, a letter was forwarded to my new address from the old brownstone. It was a standard-sized envelope, the paper smelling faintly of ozone and old metallic dust. Inside, there was a single, meticulously folded piece of paper, the same spider-like script. I miss the quiet routine of your sleep. The new walls are too thin. You are still too loud. My terror is now complete. He is not in the walls of the brownstone anymore. He is not a squatter. He is a predator, or perhaps a shadow twin, and he has been following me. He has learned my quiet routine, and I know that somewhere in the dead space between the insulation, the vents, and the concrete of my new modern high-rise, there is a pair of black, dilated eyes watching me, waiting for me to be still enough, quiet enough, for him to slip out and finally introduce himself. And I know with crushing certainty that I will never be truly alone again. I found my missing dog. But it wasn't my dog anymore. Buster was more than a dog. He was my anchor. In the 3 years since I'd moved into the old farmhouse, with its creaking floors and the vast whispering woods that pressed in on all sides, he had been the steady, thumping heartbeat of my quiet life. He was 100 pounds of goofy, slobbery, unconditionally loving golden retriever, a walking antidote to the silence that had settled in after my divorce. His disappearance wasn't a gradual thing. It was a violent tearing in the fabric of my reality. One moment he was there, chasing a squirrel at the edge of the property line where the manicured lawn gave way to the tangled, primeval dark of the forest. The next, he was gone. There was no yelp, no bark, just a sudden, deafening silence. The weeks that followed were a special kind of hell, a blurry montage of sleepless nights and frantic, desperate days. I plastered every telephone pole, every community bulletin board, every gas station window for a 30-mile radius with his smiling, dopey face. "Missing!" The posters screamed in a bold black font that felt wholly inadequate to convey the gaping wound in my life. "Buster, very friendly. Family is heartbroken." I offered a reward that was more than I could afford, a number born of pure desperation. I walked those woods until my feet were blistered and my throat was raw from calling his name. I spoke to neighbors I'd only ever nodded at before. I called the local shelter every single day, my voice cracking with the same rehearsed plea. Nothing. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed him whole. Hope, a stubborn, resilient weed, began to wither. The silence in the house grew teeth. Every creak of a floorboard was him about to round the corner. Every rustle of leaves outside was him scratching at the door. But the door always remained closed. The corner always remained empty. It was on the 28th day, a Tuesday, that I found him. I'd given up, really. I was driving home late from the city, the hollowed-out feeling in my chest having settled into a permanent, dull ache. The headlights cut a lonely tunnel through the thick, rural darkness. And then I saw him, a flicker of gold at the side of the road, about a mile from my house. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the loose gravel of the shoulder. He was just standing there, in the halo of my high beams, panting slightly. He was thinner, his ribs a faint corrugated line beneath his matted, filthy coat. There was a fresh, jagged scar across his muzzle, and one of his ears had a torn, ragged edge. But it was him. It was Buster. "Buster," I whispered, my voice choked with disbelief. His head tilted. His tail gave a single tentative thump against his leg. I threw the car door open and stumbled out, a sob tearing its way out of my throat. "Buster! Oh, my God! Buster!" I ran to him and fell to my knees on the damp asphalt, wrapping my arms around his neck. He smelled of pine needles and damp earth and something else, something vaguely metallic and unpleasant, like old blood. He felt solid, real. He was here. He was alive. He licked my face, a familiar wet rasp against my cheek, and in that moment all the strangeness, all the questions, dissolved in a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated relief. The king had returned to his castle. My world had righted itself. The first hint that the world was still tilted on its axis came that very night. I filled his bowl with his favorite kibble, the expensive kind with freeze-dried chunks of salmon that he would usually inhale in under 30 seconds. He walked over to it, sniffed it once, and then turned away with a look of complete disinterest. He padded over to his water bowl and drank, a long, deep, lapping sound that seemed to go on for an eternity. "Not hungry, bud?" I asked, stroking his back. "You must be exhausted." I chalked it up to trauma. He'd been lost in the woods for a month. He'd probably been surviving on whatever he could catch. Processed kibble must have seemed alien to him now. I left a bowl out for him and went to bed, my heart so full I felt like it might burst. I fell asleep to the comforting sound of his heavy breathing from the dog bed at the foot of my own. In the morning, the food bowl was still full, untouched. But Buster seemed fine. He was sitting in the middle of the living room rug, watching me with an unnerving stillness. His tail wasn't wagging. His body wasn't wriggling with the usual good morning excitement. He was just observing. I knelt down in front of him, and he licked my hand, but the gesture felt mechanical, rote. It was like he was performing a trick he'd been taught long ago. And his eyes. That was the first thing that truly burrowed under my skin. Buster's eyes had always been two pools of warm, brown, goofy affection. They were expressive, emotional. These eyes were different. The color was the same, but the light behind them was out. They were flat, glossy, like the eyes of a taxidermied animal. They held a deep, unnerving intelligence, but it was a cold, analytical intelligence. Not the intelligence of a dog, but of something else entirely. When I looked into his eyes, I didn't feel seen by my best friend. I felt scanned, assessed. The days that followed were a slow creeping accumulation of wrongness. The subtle behavioral shifts were the most disorienting. Buster had always been a vocal dog, barking with joyous abandon at squirrels, the mailman, a car door slamming down the street. This new Buster was silent, utterly, unnervingly silent. He moved through the house with a stealth he'd never possessed before, his paws making no sound on the hardwood floors. I'd turn around from the kitchen counter, and he'd just be there, standing in the doorway, watching me. He stopped responding to commands he'd known since he was a puppy. Sit, stay, shake. The words meant nothing to him. He wouldn't even react to his own name most of the time, but he was smart, frighteningly so. He learned to open the back door by watching me turn the lever handle. He figured out how to get the lid off the kitchen trash can, not with brute, clumsy force like the old Buster, but with a delicate, precise manipulation of his paw. Then came the food issue. He continued to refuse his dog food, but he was eating. I'd come home to find packages of raw meat I'd had in the fridge torn open on the kitchen floor, the contents gone. One afternoon, I found him in the backyard, hunched over the mangled, bloody remains of a raccoon. He looked up at me, his muzzle dripping with gore, his eyes holding no shame, no fear, just that same flat, calculating stare. He wasn't my dog who would get sick from eating a piece of dropped cheese. This was a predator. I kept trying to rationalize it. He was feral now. He was relearning how to be a domesticated animal. The trauma had changed him. I clung to these explanations like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood, even as the water rose around me. The other animals in the neighborhood began to vanish. Mrs. Gable's fat ginger cat, Marmalade, who used to sun himself on our shared fence line. The yappy little terrier from 2 houses down. They just disappeared. I'd see their missing posters go up, their owners' faces etched with the same panicked grief I had known, and a cold, sick feeling would pool in my stomach. I'd look at Buster, lying placidly on the rug, and he would meet my gaze, his tail giving that same single, deliberate thump. "I know what you're thinking," his eyes seemed to say, "but you can't prove it." The mimicry was the most insidious, the most psychologically shredding part of the ordeal. Just when I would become convinced that this creature was a complete imposter, it would do something that was so perfectly, quintessentially Buster, that it would shatter my resolve. It would suddenly nudge its head under my hand for a scratch behind the ears in that specific way he always had. It would let out a soft, contented groan as I rubbed his belly, a sound I knew as well as my own heartbeat. But these moments were always slightly off-key. They felt like carefully deployed weapons designed to confuse me, to keep me off balance, to make me doubt my own sanity. It wasn't him remembering, it was it learning. It was perfecting its role, using my own reactions as a guide. The breaking point, the moment my desperate denial finally crumbled into dust, happened in the woods. I'd been hearing strange noises from the forest at night, a high-pitched, chittering sound, almost insect-like. One Saturday, driven by a morbid curiosity I couldn't explain, I went looking. I took Buster with me, or rather, he followed me, a silent golden shadow at my heels. I pushed deeper into the trees than I usually did, into the damp, primordial heart of the woods. And then I found it, a small clearing, hidden by a thicket of thorns. In the center was a shallow pit, and in the pit were bones, animal bones mostly. Deer, raccoon, a few smaller skeletons I recognized with a sickening lurch as cats, and half buried in the dirt, caked in mud but still glinting in the dappled sunlight, was a small metal object. It was Buster's old collar, the red leather one with the brass name tag, the one he had been wearing the day he disappeared. It was torn, as if it had been ripped off with incredible force. I stared at it, the world dissolving into a low, buzzing hum in my ears. The real Buster had never come home. The real Buster had died out here in this place. My best friend was gone. The creature standing silently behind me, the one wearing his face, his fur, his body, was his killer. It was a cuckoo in the nest, a monster that had murdered my family and then come home to live with me. I turned around slowly. The thing that looked like my dog was watching me, its head tilted. There was no pretense in its eyes now, no attempt at canine affection, just a cold, ancient alien intelligence. It knew that I knew. The game was over. Its mouth opened, but not to pant. The jaw unhinged, stretching wider than any dog's jaw should, revealing rows of needle-sharp, almost shark-like teeth. And from deep within its throat came a sound, a wet, clicking, multi-toned sound that was a grotesque mimicry of my own voice. Alex, it rasped, the name broken and distorted. Good boy. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped behind a wall of pure, paralyzing terror. I just backed away, step by agonizing step, my eyes locked on the abomination in front of me. It took a step forward, and its form seemed to shift, to ripple. Its front legs elongated, the joints cracking and reforming, becoming more like arms. Its spine lengthened, and it began to rise unsteadily onto its hind legs. It was a thing of impossible angles and fluid, unnatural movement, a half-formed nightmare struggling out of a familiar, comforting disguise. That's when I ran. I turned and sprinted through the woods, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning. I didn't look back, but I could hear it behind me. It wasn't the sound of a running dog. It was a heavier, faster, loping gait, accompanied by that horrible, chittering click. It was toying with me. It could have caught me at any second. I burst out of the woods and didn't stop. I ran into my house, slammed and bolted the door, my hands shaking so violently I could barely work the lock. I stood there panting, my back pressed against the wood, listening. Silence. Then a soft, familiar scratching sound at the door. A plaintive, heartbreaking whimper, a perfect imitation of Buster when he wanted to be let in. "Alex," the whimper seemed to say, "let me in. I'm your best friend." I fled. I grabbed my keys and my wallet and nothing else. I went out the front door, got in my car and drove. I drove for hours, not caring where I was going, just putting as much distance as possible between me and that house, between me and that thing. That was a year ago. I live in a city now, a high-rise apartment on the 32nd floor, surrounded by the comforting, anonymous noise of millions of people. I don't own any pets. I flinch when I see a golden retriever on the street. I have nightmares every night. I know what it is now, at least in the abstract. I've spent countless hours in the dark corners of the internet, reading hushed-up folklore and frantic, pseudo-scientific theories. It has many names: skinwalker, a doppelganger, an echo, a thing that watches, that learns, that imitates, a predator that doesn't just hunt for food, but for lives. It steals them, wears them like a coat, and it does it so perfectly that you almost don't notice until it's too late. I thought I had escaped, but a few weeks ago I was walking home from work and saw a poster taped to a lamppost. It was for a missing cat, a fluffy Persian named Snowball. I would have ignored it, but something made me stop. It was the photo, a cheap color copy of a cat looking at the camera. But its eyes, they were flat, black, and held a cold, calculating intelligence that had nothing to do with a cat. They held an unnerving familiarity. I tore the poster down, my hands shaking. I know it's out there. It's here, in this city. It's shed its old skin and is trying on a new one. And I know with a certainty that has become the new anchor in my life that it's hunting again. And maybe, just maybe, it remembers me. The motel was a fossil, a perfectly preserved specimen from an era of chrome, linoleum, and a kind of desperate roadside optimism that no longer exists. It was called the Starlight Vista, a grand, ludicrous name for a low-slung, L-shaped building of peeling paint and buzzing neon that offered a stunning vista of a gas station and a 24-hour diner. I was the night clerk, a post I had occupied for the past 6 years. My name is Arthur, and my life had become a long, quiet, and deeply repetitive night, punctuated only by the arrival of the occasional weary traveler or the distant melancholy wail of a train passing through the dark. The Starlight Vista was a place of ghosts, but not the spooky kind. It was haunted by the ghosts of salesmen with worn-out briefcases, of families on cross-country trips in wood-paneled station wagons, of lovers meeting for clandestine, lukewarm affairs. Every scuff on the floor, every cigarette burn on the Formica countertops was a small, silent testament to a life that had passed through and moved on. I was the curator of this museum of transient lives. My nightly ritual was as fixed and unchanging as the constellations. I'd make a pot of coffee that was strong enough to dissolve a spoon. I'd read the local paper with a kind of detached anthropological interest, and I'd check the reservation ledger. The ledger was the one anomaly in my otherwise predictable world. It was a thick, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and soft with age, a holdover from the pre-digital era that the motel's owner, a flinty, unsentimental old man named Mr. Gable refused to replace. And in that ledger there was the mystery of Room 9. Every single night, for as long as I had worked there, the entry for Room 9 was the same. A single, neat, and unchanging line, written in a precise, slightly old-fashioned cursive, J. Corbin. No first name, no payment information, no check-in time. Just the name. The reservation was a permanent, unmovable fixture in the book. The first time I asked Mr. Gable about it, he had given me a look that was as cold and sharp as a shard of broken glass. "Room 9 is not your concern, Arthur," he'd said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "It's occupied, permanently. You do not knock on the door. You do not slide a bill under it. You simply leave it be. Is that understood?" It was not an invitation for a conversation. It was an order. And for 6 years I had obeyed it. I had treated Room 9 as if it did not exist. It was a blank spot on the map of my small nocturnal kingdom, but my curiosity, a slow, patient, and persistent creature, had been gnawing at the edges of my obedience for years. I had done the math. I had gone back, page by yellowed page, through the old ledgers that were stored in the back office. The reservation for J. Corbin had started on a Tuesday, October 14th, 1986, and it had never stopped. 39 years, 14,235 nights, a single, unbroken reservation. Who was J. Corbin? Was he a recluse, a modern-day Howard Hughes, living out his days in a cheap roadside motel? But I had never seen anyone go in or out of that room. The housekeeping staff, 2 quiet middle-aged sisters named Maria and Sophia, never cleaned it. When I had asked them, they had just crossed themselves and shaken their heads, muttering something in Spanish about bad air. The room itself was a paradox. It was at the far end of the west wing, the last door on the left. The paint on the door was not peeling. The brass number 9 was not tarnished. The "Do Not Disturb" sign, a small plastic rectangle, hung permanently from the knob. Its red letters faded to a pale, anemic pink. The window that faced the parking lot was always dark, its thick mustard-yellow curtains always drawn. But the room was not dead. It consumed electricity. I had checked the meters in the maintenance closet. Room 9 drew a steady, consistent, and low-level amount of power day and night. The kind of power draw you'd see from a single, low-wattage light bulb. And maybe an old, inefficient clock radio. My quiet, ordered life was built around this one, singular, and deeply unsettling mystery. And for 6 years I had been content to let it remain one. But then Mr. Gable died. A heart attack, swift and efficient in his sleep. His estranged daughter, a brisk, no-nonsense woman from the city, inherited the motel. And her first order of business was to modernize. A team of contractors descended upon the starlight vista, and the comfortable, dusty silence of my life was shattered by the sound of hammers and power saws. They were replacing the carpets, updating the wiring, and, to my horror, installing a new computerized reservation system. The leather-bound ledger, my strange anachronistic Bible, was to be retired. I knew my time was running out. The new system would not tolerate the gentle, unspoken mystery of J. Corbin. It would demand a credit card number, a check-in date, a digital footprint. The ghost in my machine was about to be exorcised by an IT professional. I had to know. I had to understand. Before the bulldozers of the 21st century paved over the one true and profound mystery of my life, The night before the new system was scheduled to go online, I made my decision. The contractors were gone. The motel was quiet, save for the hum of the ice machine and the snores of a traveling salesman in room 3. I took the master key, a heavy old-fashioned brass key that I had never in 6 years had a reason to use for room 9. My footsteps echoed in the empty parking lot as I walked towards the west wing. The air was cold and still. The buzzing of the neon sign seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as I approached the door. I stood before it for a long moment, my heart a frantic, trapped bird in my chest. The faded "Do Not Disturb" sign seemed to mock me. My hand trembled as I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, silent, and well-oiled click that was deeply, profoundly unnerving. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of asphalt and impending revelation, and I pushed the door open. The room was not what I expected. It was not a dusty, forgotten time capsule. It was not the squalid den of a recluse. It was a waiting room. The room was immaculate. The bed, a standard motel-issue double, was made with military precision. The cheap polyester bedspread pulled taut, not a single wrinkle on its surface. The carpet, a swirling psychedelic pattern of orange and brown, was perfectly vacuumed. There was not a speck of dust on the faux wood headboard or the formica top of the small round table. But the room was not empty. On the table, next to a small bakelite lamp that was emitting a soft, warm, golden glow, was a single open book. And sitting in the room's only armchair, a worn vinyl monstrosity the color of a bruised avocado, was a man. He was old, but it was an age that was impossible to quantify. He was dressed in a simple, gray, and slightly old-fashioned suit. His face was a road map of wrinkles, but his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were clear, sharp, and utterly, completely ancient. He was not a ghost. He was solid. He was real. And he was looking directly at me. He did not seem surprised. He seemed patient, as if he had been waiting for me to open that door for a very, very long time. "Arthur," he said, his voice a low, soft, and impossibly tired sound. "You're early. I wasn't expecting you for another 17 years. I stared at him, my mind a screaming white noise chaos of disbelief. Who are you?" I stammered. "Are you Jay Corbin?" He smiled, a faint, sad, and deeply weary smile. "In a manner of speaking, it's a professional name, a designation. You can call me Jonas." "What is this place?" I whispered, my eyes darting around the clean, sterile, and utterly soulless room. "What have you been doing in here for 39 years?" "Waiting," he said simply, "and working." He gestured to the open book on the table. I took a hesitant step into the room. The air was still and cool, and it had a strange, neutral, almost non-existent smell. It was like the air in a clean room, a place where the outside world was not allowed to enter. I looked at the book. It was a ledger, identical to the one I used at the front desk, and it was open to today's date. All the rooms were marked as vacant, except for one, Room 9, J. Corbin, and beneath it a new line had been added in the same neat and precise cursive. Arthur Penhaligon, 11:17 p.m., my name. I looked up at him, a cold, creeping dread, far worse than any simple, superstitious fear, beginning to seep into my bones. "What is this?" "I'm a clerk, Arthur," Jonas said, his ancient blue eyes holding mine. "Just like you. A manager of a very specific and very necessary kind of roadside motel. He gestured around the room. This isn't just a room, it's a layover, a transfer station, a place between the road you were on and the one you're about to be on. I don't understand, I said, my voice trembling. You're not supposed to, he said, his voice gentle. Not yet. Your reservation isn't for another 17 years, but you've opened the door. You've checked in early. And the rules are very strict about early check-ins. My mind was reeling, trying to process the sheer cosmic impossibility of his words. This was not a man. This was something else. And this motel, my quiet, predictable, and boring little motel, was a part of it. What are you? I whispered. I am the one who helps the lost find their way, he said. The ones who die on the road. The ones who are untethered. A car crash on the interstate, a lonely heart attack in a room that isn't their own. A soul that has, for one reason or another, missed its exit. They get stuck in a static between the stations. This place, this room, is a beacon, a quiet, stable place in the storm. And I am the one who sits here and waits for them to find their way to the front desk. I thought of the thousands of lives that had passed through the starlight vista, the salesmen, the families, the lovers, and I thought of the others, the quiet ones, the ones who checked in and never checked out, the small, forgotten tragedies that are the lifeblood of any place that is built on the lonely, anonymous promise of the open road. And what do you do with them? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I check them in, he said. I give them a key, and I help them to understand that the trip they were on is over, and that a new one is about to begin. He looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a sadness that was as old and as deep as the universe itself. My work is very important, Arthur. It requires quiet. It requires discretion. It requires a place that is constant. I understood then. The reservation, the untouched room, the low, steady hum of the electricity. It was all a part of it, an anchor, a lighthouse for the lost souls of the highway. And my mundane, boring, and quiet little life had been lived unknowingly in the shadow of this profound and terrifying cosmic machinery. But why me? I asked. Why are you telling me this? Because you opened the door, he said, his voice taking on a new, graver tone. And because my own reservation is coming due. I have been a clerk here for a very, very long time. My own journey is about to continue, and a place like this can never be left unattended. The implication of his words hit me with the force of a physical blow. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in. No, I said, shaking my head. No, I have a life. I am a clerk at a motel. You were a clerk at a motel, he corrected gently. But you chose to open a door that was not meant for you. You have seen behind the curtain, Arthur, and once you have seen, you cannot unsee. You are a part of the mechanism now. He stood up, his movement slow and stiff, like a man who had been sitting in the same chair for 1,000 years. He walked over to me, and he placed a heavy, cold brass key in my hand. It was the master key for room 9. Your training was supposed to be gradual, he said, his voice a soft, tired whisper in my ear. Over the next 17 years, you would have begun to see, to understand. But now you will have to learn on the job. He walked past me, towards the open door of the room. He did not look back. He stepped out into the dark, silent parking lot of my world, and he dissolved. He didn't vanish in a puff of smoke. He just faded. He became a part of the darkness, a part of the quiet, a part of the lonely, endless night of the open road. I was alone in the room, the clean, sterile waiting room. The book was still on the table, open to my name. The soft, golden light of the lamp was still glowing. I was the new clerk, the new manager, the new J. Corbin. I walked out of the room and pulled the door shut. It clicked with a soft, final sound. I hung the faded "Do Not Disturb" sign back on the knob. I walked back to the front desk, the heavy brass key in my pocket, a cold, heavy weight. The new computerized reservation system was installed the next day, but when the technician tried to input the data for room 9, the system crashed. They tried 3 times. Every time, the same result. The new digital world could not comprehend the old analog and cosmic truth of that room. In the end, they just left it alone, a single, anomalous, and permanent booking in a system that was otherwise perfect, a ghost in the new machine. My life is different now. It is still quiet. It is still nocturnal. I am still the clerk at a roadside motel. But I have a new set of responsibilities. I still make the coffee. I still read the paper. But now I also watch. And I listen. And sometimes, in the dead of night, a new guest will arrive. They will look confused and lost and afraid. They will not have a reservation, but I will know their name. I will check them in, and I will give them a key to a room that is not on any map, a quiet, clean, and peaceful room, a place where they can rest before they continue on their journey. I have 17 years until my own check-in, 17 years to be the quiet, patient, and necessary guardian of the lost souls of the Starlight Vista. It is a strange and lonely and sometimes terrifying job. But I have come to understand that it is also a profound and deeply and strangely sacred one. The road is long and the night is dark, and everyone eventually needs a place to rest, and I am the one who leaves the light on. I'm a paramedic. The body I picked up spoke my name. The rain wasn't just falling. It was a solid, percussive thing, an endless drum solo on the roof of the ambulance. Each drop that hit the windshield was fat and heavy, exploding in a starburst of light from the street lamps before the wipers smeared it away. It was the kind of night that bled into morning without ever truly getting light, a perpetual state of 3 a.m. gloom. My name is Alex, and for the past 8 years, the soundtrack to my life has been a siren, the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, and the weary sigh of my partner Sarah after a particularly nasty call. We work the night shift in a city that never really sleeps but often dies in its bed. You get used to it. You have to. The horror, the grief, the sheer, sticky mess of human fragility. You build a callus over your soul, a thick, protective layer that allows you to intubate a dying man without your hands shaking and declare a stranger dead without your voice cracking. Tonight was a slow bleed, a fender bender, a drunk who'd fallen down a flight of stairs, a kid with a febrile seizure, the usual smorgasbord of urban misery. We were parked in our designated spot outside the ER. The smell of antiseptic wipes and stale coffee thickened the cab. Sarah was scrolling through her phone, the blue light making her face look hollow. I was staring out at the rain, letting the rhythmic squeak of the wipers lull me into a state of semi-consciousness. Then the radio crackled, a burst of static followed by the calm, disembodied voice of dispatch. Unit 73, respond to a wellness check. 1432 Blackwood Avenue. Repeat, 1432 Blackwood. Police are on scene. No answer at the door. Neighbor reports a foul odor. A wellness check with a foul odor. That was code. It meant we weren't going to be saving anyone. We were going to be dealing with the aftermath, the lonely, quiet end that nobody wants to think about. I keyed to Mike. 73 responding. Sarah sighed, pocketing her phone. Blackwood Avenue? Isn't that out by the old mill district? The very same, I said, putting the ambulance in gear. The part of town the city forgot to pave. The drive was quiet. The rain intensified, and the world outside became a blurry watercolor of bleeding reds and yellows. Blackwood Avenue was a street of ghosts. The houses were old Victorians, most of them in a state of terminal decline, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin, their porches sagging like the jaws of old men. 1432 was the worst of the lot. It was set back from the road, partially consumed by an overgrown garden of weeds and thorny bushes that scraped against the side of the ambulance as I pulled into the driveway. A single police cruiser was parked at the curb, its lights off, making it look like an abandoned wreck. Two officers, a rookie named Evans and a veteran I recognized as Miller, met us on the porch. The smell hit us as soon as we stepped out of the cab. It was sweet and cloying, the unmistakable scent of decay. It's a smell you never forget and one that clings to the inside of your nostrils for hours. He's in the living room, Miller said, his face impassive. Looks like he's been there a while. Name's Arthur Pendleton. Neighbor hadn't seen him in about a week. We donned our gloves and masks, the thin layer of latex and paper, a pathetic shield against the reality we were about to face. The front door was already ajar, splintered around the lock where the police had forced it open. Inside, the house was a time capsule. Dust motes danced in the beams of our flashlights, illuminating furniture draped in white sheets, yellowed wallpaper peeling at the seams, and stacks of old newspapers that reached the ceiling. It was the home of a man who had been alone for a very, very long time. He was in an armchair, facing a dead television. He was old, skeletal thin, his skin the color of old parchment and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were closed and his mouth was slightly open, as if he had been in the middle of a sigh when his life had simply stopped. There were no signs of trauma, no indication of a struggle, just a quiet, lonely exit. It was a scene we'd witnessed 100 times before. The forgotten ones, the people who die and the world doesn't notice for a week. We did our work, the grim, necessary protocol. I checked for a pulse I knew I wouldn't find. Sarah listened for breath sounds that weren't there. We hooked him up to the monitor, a formality for the paperwork, and watched the flat, unwavering line march across the screen. Time of death was impossible to determine. We just wrote down the time we'd found him. "All right," I said, my voice muffled by the mask. "Let's get him on the gurney." We brought in the body bag and the gurney. It was always the worst part. The transition from a person, a former life, into cargo. We positioned ourselves on either side of the armchair. Sarah took his shoulders and I took his legs. The body was stiff, rigor mortis having come and gone, leaving a strange plastic-like flexibility in the limbs. "On 3, I said. 1, 2, 3. We lifted. He was lighter than he looked, almost bird-like. As we maneuvered him out of the chair, his head lolled to the side, turning towards me. His thin, papery eyelids fluttered. I froze. It was a common phenomenon, a result of shift in post-mortem gases or muscle relaxation. I'd seen it before, but it was always unnerving. "You good?" Sarah asked, her voice strained from the weight. "Yeah," I grunted. "Just weird angle." We lowered him into the body bag. He was lying on his back, his face now pointing up at the ceiling. I reached for the zipper, my hand hovering over his chest. That's when it happened. His lips, dry and cracked like a sun-baked riverbed, pulled back from his teeth. A soft, airy sound escaped, a puff of putrid air that carried a single, impossible word. Alex. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't even a full-voiced whisper. It was a rasp, a dry rustle of dead leaves, the sound of a voice that hadn't been used in a long, long time. But it was my name, unmistakably my name. My blood turned to ice water. Every hair on my arm stood on end. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp, painful hitch. I stared down at the dead man, at his still, silent mouth. Had I imagined it? The stress, the long night, the oppressive atmosphere of the house. My mind had to be playing tricks on me. "What was that?" Sarah's voice cut through my paralysis. My head snapped up. I looked at her, my eyes wide above my mask. "You heard that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She was staring at the body, her face pale. I don't know. It sounded like the wind." But she didn't look convinced. She looked as scared as I felt. I looked back down at Arthur Pendleton. His face was placid again, a mask of serene decay. There was no sign that he had just shattered my understanding of reality. My training, my experience, everything I knew about life and death told me it was impossible. Dead men don't speak, and they certainly don't know your name. I zipped the bag. The sound of the zipper was unnaturally loud in the silent house, a final, definitive act. But nothing felt final. It felt like the beginning of something terrible. The trip to the morgue was the longest 10 minutes of my life. I drove, my hands clenched so tightly on the steering wheel that my knuckles were white. I kept my eyes glued to the road, but my mind was in the back of the ambulance with the black bag strapped to the gurney. Every bump, every turn sent a fresh jolt of fear through me. Was he moving back there? Was he trying to sit up? I could feel the weight of his presence, a cold, heavy thing that had nothing to do with his physical body. Sarah was silent in the passenger seat, staring out her window. I didn't know if she was trying to convince herself that she hadn't heard what I had, or if she was just too scared to talk about it. We had an unspoken rule. We didn't take the horrors of the job home with us. We saw things that would break most people, and we compartmentalized. We had to. But this wasn't the kind of horror you could put in a box. This felt like it had followed us out of the house. At the hospital, we bypassed the bustling ER and went straight to the morgue entrance in the basement. The air down there was always cold, with the clean, chemical smell of disinfectant failing to mask a deeper, earthier odor. The attendant, a burly, perpetually bored man named Frank, met us at the door. "Got another one for me?" he asked, not looking up from his crossword puzzle. "Yeah, Frank. DOA from Blackwood Avenue," Sarah said, her voice a little too high. We wheeled the gurney in. The room was sterile and bright, all stainless steel and white tile. It was a place designed to be devoid of emotion, a clean, efficient processing center for the dead. But tonight, it felt like the most terrifying place on earth. As we transferred the bag from our gurney to one of Frank's tables, I could have sworn I felt a faint vibration from inside, a subtle shifting of weight. I let go so quickly my hand recoiled as if I'd been burned. Frank tagged the bag with the name Arthur Pendleton. Then he wheeled him over to one of the refrigerated units, a wall of identical steel doors. He pulled one open, a cloud of cold vapor billowing out. With a practiced heave, he slid the body inside. The door closed with a heavy metallic thud, and the lock clicked into place. It was over. He was gone. But as we walked back to the ambulance, I felt a cold draft on the back of my neck, and I heard it again, as clear as if someone were standing right behind me, a faint, sibilant whisper on the edge of my hearing. "Alex." I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. The hallway was empty. Sarah was already climbing into the driver's side of the ambulance. She hadn't heard it. This time, it was just for me. The rest of the shift passed in a haze. We had 2 more calls, a drug overdose and a car accident, but I moved through them like an automaton. My body was there, my hands were performing the familiar tasks, but my mind was miles away, trapped in that dusty house, replaying that impossible moment over and over again. I kept telling myself it was a hallucination, a product of exhaustion and a morbid scene. But I couldn't shake the feeling, the cold, primal certainty that something had latched onto me. Something from that old house, something that wore the face of Arthur Pendleton. When our shift finally ended, the sun was a weak, gray smear on the horizon. I drove home in a stupor, the city still sleeping around me. My apartment, usually a sanctuary from the chaos of my job, felt alien and threatening. The familiar creaks of the old building sounded like footsteps. The hum of the refrigerator sounded like a low, guttural moan. I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my ears straining for any sound. Every shadow in the corner of my room seemed to coalesce into the shape of a tall, thin man. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his cracked lips, his papery skin, and I heard my name, whispered in that dry, dead voice. The next few days were a waking nightmare. At work, I became jumpy and irritable. Every DOA call sent a spike of adrenaline and fear through my system. I found myself hesitating before touching the bodies, my hands trembling. Sarah noticed. "You've been on edge ever since that call on Blackwood," she said one night as we sat in the ambulance. "What's going on, Alex?" I wanted to tell her. I wanted to tell her that I was hearing things, that I felt like I was being watched, that I was convinced the dead man we'd picked up was haunting me. But how could I? She'd think I was losing my mind. She'd report me to our supervisor, and I'd be on administrative leave, forced into therapy. So I lied. "Just tired," I mumbled. "Haven't been sleeping well." She didn't press, but I could see the concern in her eyes. The wall of professional detachment between us was cracking. At home, things escalated. It started with small things. Objects would be slightly out of place. My keys on the wrong side of the table, a book I was reading open to a different page. Then came the sounds. The whispering became more frequent, no longer just on the edge of my hearing, but clear, distinct, and always, always my name. I started hearing footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment door, only to find no one there when I looked through the peephole. One night, I was in the bathroom washing my face. When I looked up into the mirror, he was there. For a split second, standing behind me, was the gaunt figure of Arthur Pendleton. He was just a reflection, translucent and wavering, but his eyes were open, and they were staring right at me. I cried out and stumbled back, splashing water all over the floor. By the time I looked again, he was gone. That was when the denial finally shattered. This wasn't stress. This wasn't my imagination. This was real. I was being haunted. My rational mind, the part of me that was a paramedic, that dealt in facts and evidence, screamed for an explanation. I had to know who Arthur Pendleton was. What had he been in life that had allowed him to cling to me so tenaciously in death? Breaking protocol, I used my access to the hospital's record system. I pulled up the file from our call. Arthur Pendleton, age 87, no listed next of kin, no emergency contacts. He was a ghost even before he died. I dug deeper, cross-referencing his name and address in public records databases. I spent hours scrolling through digitized archives of old newspapers, property deeds, census records, and then I found it. A small article from a local newspaper dated 1958. The headline read, "Local man claims contact with the other side." The article was about a young Arthur Pendleton who had caused a stir in the community by claiming to be a medium. He held seances in his house on Blackwood Avenue, claiming he could speak to the dead. He also spoke of a theory he called solic transference, the idea that a consciousness at the moment of death could imprint itself onto a receptive living person, a vessel, and continue to experience the world through them. The article dismissed him as a charlatan and a crank. But as I read his words, a cold dread washed over me. He wasn't just a forgotten old man. He was a man who had spent his life obsessed with cheating death. And I had been the first person to touch him when he finally succeeded. The knowledge didn't bring me peace. It brought terror. I wasn't just being haunted by a ghost. I was being targeted by a consciousness that wanted to use me. The activity in my apartment intensified dramatically. The whispers were now full sentences, fragmented and nonsensical, but in that same dry, rasping voice. "So cold? Let me in. I see with your eyes." One evening, I was heating up soup on the stove. I turned my back for a moment to grab a bowl, and when I turned back, every cabinet and drawer in my kitchen was wide open. Another night, I woke up to find all the faucets in my apartment turned on, the sound of rushing water filling the silence. The most terrifying incident happened with my television. I was watching a movie when the screen suddenly went to static. A face began to form in the swirling black and white dots. It was his face, Arthur Pendleton's face. His mouth opened, and a distorted electronic version of my own voice came out of the speakers. "Help me," it said in my voice. "He's trying to get in." I was losing my grip. I was afraid to be in my own home. I was afraid to go to sleep. My work suffered. I made a mistake on a call, gave the wrong dosage of a drug. Sarah caught it and corrected me, saving me from a potentially fatal error. That night, she cornered me in the hospital parking lot. "That's it, Alex," she said, her arms crossed. "I'm not letting you brush this off anymore. You almost killed someone tonight. You're not just tired, you're falling apart. Talk to me now." The dam broke. I told her everything, about the whisper in the dead man's house, about hearing my name in the morgue, about the reflection in the mirror, the whispers, the television. I told her about the old newspaper article and Arthur Pendleton's insane theory. I expected her to recoil, to tell me I was crazy. but she just listened, her expression growing more and more grim. When I was finished, she was silent for a long time. "I heard it too, you know," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "In the house. I heard him say your name. I've been trying to convince myself I didn't, but I did." A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. I wasn't crazy. Someone else knew. I wasn't alone in this. But our shared knowledge made the situation infinitely more real and therefore more dangerous. The haunting was no longer just my problem. It was ours, and it was getting stronger. The next shift, we were responding to a call when the radio in the cab crackled. It was dispatch, but the voice was distorted, overlaid with a dry, rasping sound. "Unit 73, Alex, where are you going?" Sarah and I looked at each other, our faces ashen. Even dispatch called back, asking if we had a problem with our radio. Arthur was no longer confined to my apartment. He was following me, bleeding into the technology I used every day, using my own voice to taunt me. He was getting closer, trying to push me out and take my place. We knew we couldn't go to the police or our supervisors. They would put us on psych leave so fast our heads would spin. We were on our own. We spent our days off in the library, researching the occult, spiritualism, anything we could find on Sulik transference or consciousness imprinting. Most of it was nonsense, but we found recurring themes, fragmented bits of lore about entities that anchor themselves to the living. The consensus was grim. The longer the connection lasted, the stronger the entity became, and the weaker the host's own consciousness grew. Eventually, the host would be pushed out entirely, their body becoming a vessel for the invading spirit. We realized we had to do something drastic. We had to go back to where it all started. We had to go back to 1432 Blackwood Avenue. The house was even more decrepit than I remembered. A yellow "No Trespassing" sign had been slapped on the door, but the police tape was torn and fluttering in the wind. We broke in through a side window, the sound of shattering glass echoing in the silent street. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The dust was thicker, the silence heavier. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for us. We had a vague plan, cobbled together from the pseudo-religious texts we'd found. We needed to perform a kind of severance, a ritual to break Arthur's connection to me. We brought salt, candles, and an old iron railroad spike we'd found, which one of the books claimed could pin down a restless spirit. It felt absurd, like we were LARPing a horror movie, but we were desperate. We went to the living room, to the armchair where he had died. As I stepped into the room, the temperature dropped precipitously. The air grew thick and heavy, and an overwhelming sense of despair washed over me. This was his place. This was the heart of his power. "I can feel him," I whispered to Sarah, my teeth chattering. "I know," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Let's just do this and get out." She began to pour a circle of salt around the armchair while I set up the candles. As I lit the first one, a wind swept through the sealed room, extinguishing the flame. I tried again. This time all the candles flared up at once, their flames burning unnaturally tall and bright. And then the whispers started, not just my name anymore, a cacophony of voices, swirling around the room, echoing from the walls. They were the voices of the dead, the spirits Arthur had claimed to speak to, all trapped here with him. "He is one of us now," a woman's voice hissed. "You cannot take him," a man's voice boomed. The house began to shake. The stacks of newspapers toppled over, sending up clouds of dust. The white sheets on the furniture were ripped off by an unseen force. In the center of the room, above the armchair, the air began to shimmer and coalesce. The form of Arthur Pendleton began to take shape, not as a translucent ghost, but as a writhing, multi-limbed creature made of shadow and dust, his face contorted in a silent scream. "Alex!" Sarah yelled, grabbing my arm. "The spike! Do it now!" I held the iron spike in my trembling hand. The book had said I needed to drive it into the source of the haunting. I looked at the swirling vortex of darkness above the chair. That was him. That was the thing that had been tormenting me. I took a step forward, and the entity focused on me. Its shadowy form lunged, not at my body, but at my mind. I felt a crushing pressure in my skull, a wave of cold, desolate energy that tried to scour my own thoughts away. I saw flashes of Arthur's life. A lonely boy in a big, empty house. A young man mocked for his beliefs. An old man sitting in a chair, waiting for death, not with fear, but with anticipation, with a plan. He was trying to show me his loneliness, his pain, trying to make me understand, to make me give in. He flooded my mind with his own memories, and in that moment I understood his desperate, pathetic plan. He didn't want to just possess me. He wanted me to become him, to trade my life for his willingly. "No," I gasped, stumbling back. "Don't listen to him, Alex," Sarah shouted. "Fight him." I knew I couldn't overpower him. He was too strong here. But as his consciousness pressed in on mine, I felt something else. I felt his fear. He was terrified of oblivion, terrified of being alone in the dark. That was his weakness. I stopped fighting him directly. Instead of pushing back, I focused my mind. I thought about my own life. I thought about the first time I saved someone, a little girl who had been pulled from a swimming pool, her skin blue. I remembered the feeling of her heart starting to beat again under my hands. I thought about Sarah, the bond we shared, the countless hours we'd spent together, the unspoken trust between us. I thought about the sun on my face, the taste of coffee, the sound of rain on a window pane when I was safe in my bed. I flooded our shared mental space with the vibrancy, the warmth, the messy, beautiful chaos of being alive. The shadowy form recoiled, screeching, a sound that was both in the room and inside my head. My life, my connections, my will to live, it was like poison to him. "You are nothing but a memory," I shouted, my voice raw. "You are dead, and you will stay that way." I surged forward, pushing through the wall of cold, and plunged the iron spike deep into the cushions of the armchair, into the very spot where his body had sat. The moment the spike sank into the fabric, the entity let out a final, agonizing shriek that shattered the remaining windows in the house. The shadowy form imploded, collapsing in on itself, and the room was plunged into an abrupt, deafening silence. The candles went out. The shaking stopped. The oppressive cold vanished, replaced by the natural musty chill of the abandoned house. We stood there panting in the near darkness, surrounded by salt and shattered glass. It was over. I could feel it. The presence in my mind was gone. The cold spot on my soul had vanished. I was alone in my own head for the first time in weeks. We didn't stay to clean up. We scrambled out the broken window and ran, not stopping, until we were back in the car, speeding away from Blackwood Avenue. We never spoke of what happened in that house. We didn't need to. We had faced the impossible together. and we had survived. I left my job a month later. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't walk into a stranger's house, not knowing what lingered there. I couldn't touch a dead body without a flicker of that old fear returning, the fear that it might open its eyes, that it might know my name. Sarah stayed on. She was stronger than me. We're still friends, but there's a distance between us now, a shared trauma that we can't ever truly move past. I moved to a new city, got a new job, a quiet, boring office job. I tried to build a new life, to forget the rasping voice and the face and the static. Most days I succeed, but sometimes, on a quiet night, when the wind is blowing just right, I'll hear a sound, a dry rustle of leaves that sounds almost like a whisper. And in those moments, I freeze and I listen, and I pray that I don't hear my name. I broke the connection, I'm sure of it, but I also know that I was a vessel once, and some part of me will always be afraid that I left the door open just a crack, and that somewhere, in the cold and the dark, Arthur Pendleton is still waiting, still whispering, still hoping that one day I'll let him back in.